Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to MBR, or as we like to call it around here, Nothing But Rants, the show where I find topics that I'm oddly passionate about and I pontificate upon them. These are not hot takes, but rather takes that I'm hot about. What's up? You really like that?
Let's shut up and grind some tape.
Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Film Guide Network. Some MBR for you on this fine Tuesday. You know, this is about the time of the year where the offseason really starts to drag. College football really feels like it's so far out, even though it's really just about a few months out. And, you know, it's a dead period. There's not a whole lot going on. Spring practice is behind us. Spring scrimmages are behind us. And really all there is around this time of year is recruiting. So, again, things kind of start to drag, and we just keep on waiting and waiting, tallying the days, marking them down on the calendar of when the first week of college football is going to arrive. Well, today we had something drop that kind of reignites that fire a little bit. That brings back the excitement, that gets the fuel, the hatred pumping again, and the love pouring out again for college football as us fans, because the week one slate has been tabbed, it has been marked, and the kickoff times have been announced. While there were some great reactions to the kickoff times, there were also some bad ones. But just seeing it out there, seeing the graphic of all the week one games that have come out and all the week one games that are set, where they're going to be, what time they're kicking off, and knowing how you are going to spend your first college football Saturday. You can already schedule it out. You got your itinerary written out and everything. It makes you love the game of college football, and it gets you all excited again. And today that was the case for, again, the week one college football slate has been announced, has been released. And, you know, some of the talk was there's some bad noon games. There's some games that maybe we thought shouldn't have been at 3, or that should have been at 3:30 or maybe 7:30. But my whole take was, this might be one of the best college football week one slates that we've gotten in a long time, because, you know, week one is typically a time where you get some Alabama versus some like Southern Alabama matchups.
Versus Charlotte.
Yeah, you know, the cupcake games. Everybody's just kind of easing their way into the schedule. But this year, I think there's some pretty significant games in week one, and it's not going to be one where it's like, you know, I'm excited for college football to be back. But you know, it's not as exciting because there's not any real football going on. But this year, there's some fantastic games, in my opinion, this week. And I think, again, it's one of the best opening weekends of college football that we could have asked for.
Yeah, I mean, games like Miami, Florida, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, Clemson, Georgia. There's just a lot of high marquee games that are going to be excited to watch. I think just looking at the overall slate, like you said, is very exciting. Like the amount of games they have on that Thursday before. Now, obviously, they're not big marquee matchups, but it's very interesting football that you'd want to watch. So it's very exciting time, just because you see it coming now, and there's a finite date that when you know it starts, and actually people are starting to ramp up talking about it.
Yeah, you know, I knew I was down bad for college football to come back when I saw TCU at Stanford kicking off at 10:30 p.m. and that got me excited. Like, that got me pumped to think about, yes, I finally have my midnight college football game to watch. Like, I can see it, I can envision myself, and that just got me juiced up. I mean, TCU and Stanford, not exactly two of your perennial contenders in college football right now, but imagining me getting to sit on my couch after a long day of watching college football and turning on TCU at Stanford, that got me all excited. That game's going to be on ESPN. I think but the biggest reveal today was the fact that the Texas A&M and Notre Dame game is going to be where College Game Day is going to be hosted. Notre Dame at Texas A&M, probably the biggest matchup of the entire weekend, I guess you could say. Two teams that you typically don't get to see face off. I think that Miami, Florida is also a good one. I think that might have been probably the other alternative to go with. Clemson and Georgia being at a neutral site, that's probably also an option. But I like the Notre Dame at Texas A&M one.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Elko versus Riley Leonard in their first game with their respective teams. It's going to be very exciting. I don't know if necessarily there's one game that sticks out in particular to me that says, oh, this is going to be the game to watch. There's a lot of exciting games where you want to tune in. You're obviously going to want to see how they go. But I'm just more excited to see what kind of games we get in week one. Because it's always the sleeper games, in my opinion, that make week one so special. Like, if Auburn comes out and they beat the hell out of, who are they playing? Alabama A&M. Yeah, that's fine. We're going to expect that to happen. But, you know, maybe Virginia Tech and Vanderbilt getting a barn burn. Maybe Ole Miss has to deal with Furman for a little bit. Games like that where you kind of like, oh man, college football's back. Anyone can win. Because, I mean, college football week one is the peak of hope, where every team is kind of at the point where nothing bad has happened to you yet. You have hope coming into the season, and there's a lot of that coming with games and things such as that. So I'm really excited just to see how it goes.
And then the game in Dublin this year, it's Georgia Tech versus, who is it again? I can't remember who it is. I think that's the week 0 game. I can't exactly who. I know Georgia Tech is involved in that one, but
that's Florida State.
Florida State and Georgia Tech?
Florida State, Georgia Tech.
Okay, so that, you know, that again, that's a good week 0 matchup. You know, over the past couple of years, it's been like Northwestern versus Wisconsin or Nebraska, one of the two. And it's kind of like, thank goodness college football is back, but that's not exactly the game that I would want to start out in week 0. I know Miami and Florida did week 0 one year as well on a Thursday night.
Yeah, I think that was 2018.
Yeah, it was a few years ago. But again, I think this is just a great opening weekend of college football, and it just got me excited about it. And to think, this is one thing that I had crossed my mind as well, is, you know, Nick Saban's going to be on the College Game Day desk this year. He's going to be one of their keynote speakers over there on ESPN. And you know, Texas A&M and Notre Dame, him and Texas A&M had some bad blood over the past couple of years. I know Jimbo Fisher isn't there anymore, but do you think that Nick Saban takes a shot at the Aggies on his first week at the desk?
I don't think he's going to necessarily take a shot. I think Nick Saban has always kind of been tried to be fair in his analysis. I mean, even when he said what Texas A&M was doing, you know, where they were essentially buying recruits and paying players, that wasn't so far from him. That didn't really feel like a shot. Like, he's criticized his players before, and he's come on the mic and talked about how his team's playing. He doesn't really do that with other coaches. So I don't think he's going to necessarily take a jab at Jimbo Fisher, especially with him not being there anymore.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. Probably maybe not week 1. Got to ease your way into this, but definitely going to be excited to see how Nick Saban holds that position. I think people are going to like him. I think he did a great job on draft night, and obviously people want to know his takes, and he's going to probably be like he's going to be on the pedestal for college football opinions moving forward this season. A game that I think is going to be really interesting because there's so much change in both programs, and both of them are really trying to compete this year and remain competitive this year, is USC versus LSU in Las Vegas. That's a neutral site matchup. That's a Sunday, and it's at 7:30 p.m. And I think that's an interesting one because you got Miller Moss. You no longer have Caleb Williams at quarterback, and Lincoln Riley needs another big season this year. And he needs to kind of keep this ball rolling, or I guess get the ball rolling back again with Miller Moss at quarterback. You don't have this Heisman contender. You don't have all the glory at this quarterback position anymore. It's a big year for Lincoln Riley in terms of just like, can you really develop quarterbacks? You know, people can kind of throw some shade your way when it's like, well, yeah, obviously you could develop the 5-star Caleb Williams. Obviously you could develop the tail end of Jalen Hurts' career, Kyler Murray. You know, the list kind of goes on with Lincoln Riley, but this year it's Miller Moss. This isn't like a 5-star former recruit or anything like that. This is a guy that, if he has success this year, if he comes out and he beats LSU week 1, then Lincoln Riley has, by all accounts, he can attach his name to that, and he can absolutely beef up his resume with that one. Then also LSU, you got Garrett Nussmeier coming in as your quarterback, and you no longer have Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. Some hopefulness that the defense is going to improve this year with Brian Kelly in his 3rd year. You need to improve that defense. So I think it's going to be a big time matchup. I think that's one that's really interesting. You're going to get a feel for both of those teams very early on.
I think that game is kind of going to be the week 1 set the tone type game. Like, whoever wins that game is probably going to be very set up well for their season. And likewise, whoever loses that game is going to be in a lot of trouble. I think if USC comes out and loses to Auburn or loses to LSU immediately, like, it's going to be like, oh my God, what are we doing for Lincoln Riley? Like, Miller Moss isn't the guy we had. Is Lincoln Riley just propped up by Heisman quarterback play? And same for Brian Kelly. If you lose that game, it's like, well, what was he without Jaden Daniels? Is Brian Kelly the answer at LSU? You're going to start getting a lot of those questions for every lose. So a lot at stake. The question I have for you is, do you remember watching the 2014 college football season and how the vibe of that season felt a little different?
I mean, yeah, that's a while ago. Yeah, that's a while ago now, 10 years ago now.
That was the first season they had the 14 playoff, and it just felt like the vibe coming into that season was a little different. I'm getting that same vibe now because they're going to 12. And it is very interesting to watch just because obviously everyone says, you know, games still matter, but the meaning of certain games has changed a good bit. So it's going to be interesting for me to see and just kind of get a gauge how these teams are going in and playing for the games. Because it felt like during that 2014 season, yeah, everyone was trying really hard to win, but there was a different kind of atmosphere around the sport just because of that 14 play.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some newness around the sport at that time. There was something that we had never seen before. There was 4 teams now that were going to be selected by a committee. We were interested to see how that was going to work, how the rankings worked, and how the committee went about selecting teams. And it just kind of felt like it opened up the door even more for other programs to get into the mix and have a fair shot at a national title. Now this year, it's the same thing. You know, it's some newness. There's some uncertainty. There's some questions going into this year. It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how the rankings roll out each week, and like if the rankings do mean anything every single week, like how those things match up, and if they're going to go ahead and put in the group of 5 team that they think is going to get the auto bid already in the top 12, or if that's just something they're going to account for in the final rankings. There's a lot of things that are going to be interesting to follow this year. I think too, another interesting thing when I'm looking at this slate is, you know, Florida State and Georgia Tech are going to go play in Ireland on Saturday, August 24th at noon. Well, then Florida State goes and plays Monday against Boston College. That's a Monday night game in the week 1 set. So really interested to see how that goes.
Have you unplugged the lav on? Either way, we're getting some scratchy mic feedback. So, but no, going into that, just what I was saying. What were you talking about?
Oh, I was just talking about how it's an interesting schedule for Florida State to open up the year because you go to Ireland, and then you play the Monday night game.
Yeah, they don't play a
week 1.
Saturday game till their 3rd game of the season, so it's very interesting for Florida State. I don't know if that's necessarily going to affect the way they play at all. I mean, you'd have to imagine Mike Norvell's going to get those guys ready, and you're playing on a Thursday. And you're playing on Saturday in week 0. Then you've essentially a week off, and then you're playing on a Monday. So I don't think it's going to have much of an effect on the way they play. Just interesting to see how it goes for Florida State. It's playing Boston College as well. But coming into the new season, there's a lot of also new things coming in. So obviously you've got the SEC no longer being broadcasted on CBS, and we got a first look at kind of what the logo will look like today. Not necessarily you have the iconic CBS logo with the SEC, but now you've got the ESPN, which I guess it's going to be broadcasted on ABC because ESPN owns those.
All right, yeah, see, I just fixed it. I guess the lav turned off. We'll have to kind of monitor it. Just keep us updated, guys, on that. If it ends up turning off again, just let us know. That's what was going on. We had a mic that turned off, so then there was some interference there. So Sorry for the troubles there. Got everything fixed, but again, let us know. Thanks for keeping us updated in the comment section as well, and keeping us on good terms with the audio. But what were you saying? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm just talking about how the SEC on CBS is no longer a thing, and that we kind of got a first look at the logo on ABC.
Oh, yeah, we did. I don't know how impressive you can be with a logo like this, but I think, overall, it's a very nice modern look. And this is, again, one of the bigger changes to the college football season is the fact that ESPN and the SEC are now going to be combining in this. I think this is going to have some effect. I think this is kind of something you're seeing already with Georgia and Clemson with what time they're playing their games. And I think that could be something you see more common moving forward, is that it's no longer the 3:30 SEC CBS game. It's whatever ABC and ESPN want to plug you in at. And that might be at noon. It might be at 7:30. And that's something that I've been intrigued about for this year is when are they going to play these primetime games? When is if you've got the ESPN and SEC slot this week, what time are you going to be playing? Because that was the beauty of it with CBS is you always knew you were fighting for that 3:30 game. You knew what time it was going to be. And for the most part, you kind of already knew which games were going to be before they even announced. You always knew Georgia, Florida was going to be one of those. Georgia, Auburn was probably always going to be one of them. So you kind of already got a feeling. You kind of went in there with some certainty of we kind of have a feeling of what the schedule is going to look like. But this year is something that you're going to have to get accustomed to and used to, of seeing how the ESPN wants to go about these time slots.
I mean, the time slots, the logo, all that you can get correct. But I mean, the most important thing is going to be the theme song.
What's going on with the lav, man?
Is it dying again? I mean, are those batteries not charged maybe?
They should have been.
But no, I mean, obviously that the logo looks good. The time slot's going to be important, but the most important thing is getting this theme song right. You cannot replace the CBS theme song, so they've kind of got an uphill battle trying to replace that. I think even some people on Twitter are clamoring for hey, why don't we just keep the SEC on CBS theme song just because it was so iconic? So that's going to be the one thing I think is going to be missing. You're going to notice that right away. But ESPN does such a great job with broadcasting and things such as that I don't think it's going to really be an issue. How's it coming over there, Jay Will?
I think we might have got it figured
out. But no, I was saying that basically the most important thing is going to be the theme song. I don't think time slots are going to matter as much. They're not going to get the noon slate. If they get 3:30, fine. If they get 7:30, fine. The theme song, if you don't nail that, people are going to hate SEC on ABC forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt like didn't they already kind of oh no, I think CBS debuted their theme song for the Big Ten. I think that's what they did.
Weak.
But yeah, it always did hit different. When you woke up or when you were getting ready for your college football day and that CBS SEC theme song came on every single time, it brought back some nostalgia and you knew exactly what you were about to get. There was and that, again, I think that was a great thing too about the 3:30 CBS game is it was the same crew every time and you got the same couple of guys, and again, there was just some comfort around it.
Mm-hmm. Got a new logo coming in. You got some new teams in the conference as well, Texas and Oklahoma. Obviously, Texas is a perennial national title contender just from what we saw last year. Oklahoma's kind of trying to figure things out, but you saw a stat today that they might be a dark horse to make, not necessarily dominate the SEC, but kind of make a run in it.
Yeah, and I honestly kind of got it. I started to think about like who could be this dark horse team in the SEC, because I feel like we've kind of gotten one of these over the past couple of years. Like LSU and Brian Kelly's first year, they became this dark horse of, whoa, LSU's competing for the Western Division, the SEC championship game. There's a chance for them to maybe even make the college football playoff if they pulled off an upset over Georgia. It was kind of a long shot, but they were in that discussion in Brian Kelly's first year. And then you also had Tennessee in 2022. They kind of came out of nowhere and they were ranked number 1 for a week. And there was a window of opportunity even after the loss to Georgia. There's a path for them to still make the Final Four in the college football playoff. And that wasn't something that people necessarily saw coming, but with Josh Heupel in the offense over there. But Hendon Hooker, a great quarterback, and the offense was rolling that year. And they just kind of figure things out. And so this year, I was thinking of who is this team that not really anybody's talking about, or maybe people have already written them off and they're not expecting them to be this ultra competitive team, or they're not one that they think is going to finish in the top 4 of the SEC this year. And this year, I think it is Oklahoma. I think they could have a chance to be a dark horse in the SEC, because I saw this stat, and knowing who Brett Venables is and the type of coach he is, I think it is the Oklahoma Sooners, because they returned 79% of defensive production from last season. Now, the offensive production is pretty bad. They rank 111th in the country, but you have to also consider that that's without Dillon Gabriel. Dillon Gabriel is now at Oregon. They no longer have their quarterback. They're working in Jackson Arnold. But I think them having Jackson Arnold, that honestly makes them even more of a candidate to be a dark horse, because people don't know what Jackson Arnold and Oklahoma are going to look like together. There's some question marks around Oklahoma, and we haven't seen it play out this year. And so that's kind of why I think that, one, people are kind of already writing them off, because there is some uncertainty around them. There are questions around the program. But also, two, a defensive-minded head coach like Brett Venables getting a big chunk of his defense back, that could set them up for some success. And that's kind of what you need in the SEC. Everybody says that they pride themselves on defense, and people don't play defense like the SEC does anywhere else. Well, Oklahoma very well could fit the bill for a team like that.
So when you say dark horse, I guess I need to clarify. What do you think they're a dark horse for? Like dark horse to win the SEC, a dark horse to compete with everyone they play?
I think more so a dark horse to just rise up the ranks quickly and be one of these teams that is like one of the more competitive teams in the conference that nobody's really like circling down right now or checking all the boxes off for right now.
Okay. The only reason I'm hesitant to agree with you on this is traditionally in the last few conference realignments we've had, teams don't usually fare well in their first year of the conference. The only exception is Texas A&M. I mean, I think they even lost 2 games that season. They had Johnny Manziel, arguably the best quarterback in college football history. So I think there's going to be kind of a growing period for Texas as well, just because you have to go in and you have to play different teams that you haven't seen before. So I'm going to say it's probably not this year that they're going to have a dark horse, and I don't think you should expect anything spectacular from Brett Venables. I think, they might go 7-5, 8-4 is kind of the realistic look here. But there's a very real possibility that, they're 10-2, they surprise a lot of teams, they play some really good games. Jackson Arnold's a lot better than we thought, and we see why they chose him over Dillon Gabriel, but just history tells me that they're going to struggle at first coming into a new conference.
So if you had to think of a dark horse right now, like who would your pick be? Because I think everything that you said is absolutely correct. I think it's warranted to bring that up, and those are all great points because it is their first year in the conference. But it is interesting, and I know they're on kind of different levels right now. Texas is coming off of a college football playoff berth, but nobody's kind of writing Texas off because it's their first year in the conference, so we're going to expect some struggles. They're kind of just putting Oklahoma under this umbrella. But again, they're on 2 different levels right now. Steve Sarkisian has that program up and running, and it looks like they're going to be playoff contenders for the foreseeable future. But that's kind of the standard at Oklahoma too. Like just a few years ago, the standard for Oklahoma would have been, oh yeah, we're always a top 12 team. Like of course we're always going to be in the college football playoff. But now that's not necessarily the case. So if you had to think of maybe an SEC team that would outside of Oklahoma to be a dark horse, do you think? Because 9-3, in my opinion, I mean, that's probably good enough for top 4, top 5 in the conference right now. And people are saying that they might finish 8th or 9th.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real possibility a 9-3 SEC team gets in, and I don't think that Oklahoma is necessarily not the answer to be a dark horse. I also think it's really hard to say who's the dark horse in this conference because it's obviously Georgia, Texas, the upper echelons, maybe Bama, maybe Ole Miss, and then below that, there's a bunch of teams where it's like, hey, they're a really solid team that might be able to do it. Tennessee is a really solid team that could do it. Missouri is a really solid team that could. You have all these teams that are kind of on the fringe, so I feel like there's not a lot of dark horses just because there's so many teams in the middle that's like, hey, they could do it. I think Oklahoma is one of those teams. They could surprise a lot of people, but I don't necessarily believe that this is the year they're going to do it.
I think, too, why it's hard to pick one is because the teams that you would typically label as a dark horse in the preseason are already being labeled as contenders in the conference. Like Ole Miss and Missouri, those are two teams that people often like to name as a dark horse in the conference because when the Missouri was in the SEC East with Georgia, it was always going to be Georgia ahead of them, and then maybe you put in Tennessee or Florida above them. So it was kind of like, we'll circle the Tigers because this could be a team that surprises people. And for Ole Miss, it was they're competing in the West against teams like Alabama, LSU, maybe even Texas A&M on some cases. And so it was maybe the Rebels with Lane Kiffin. They can get things going and they could surprise some teams as well. Whereas this year, while there is no divisions, and again, both Missouri and Ole Miss have already been labeled as contenders in the conference. It's kind of hard to pinpoint and figure out who is going to be one of these unwritten teams that are going to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, they do benefit from having a lot of returners on defense and not as much on offense. So that is one of the things that's going from a team that does not have this going for them is Michigan. And we might see a cataclysmic drop-off, like 2010 Auburn-style drop-off. Do you have stats on that?
Yeah, I do have stats on this. So Bill Connolly, the stat guru for ESPN, if you're unfamiliar with him, he's the one that kind of always lists out teams that have the most returning production on both offense and defense every year. And he updates this throughout the year based on the transfer portal and just other factors as well. Probably some more research of diving into the roster. And so he updated it again today. And Michigan has the least amount of returning production from a season ago amongst the Power Four conferences. I mean, they are ranked 130th amongst every single team. And this is a team that just won a national title. And we knew this going into the offseason because Michigan had one of the oldest rosters in all of college football. They had a very cohesive unit, and they had a lot of returning pieces, and that's what allowed them to go compete for a national title and ultimately win the thing. But with that, and when you have a team, I think they had around 20 people that were draft eligible this year, which is why many people thought they might break the record. But now you're sitting here going into your first year with Chiron Moore, no J.J. McCarthy, no Blake Corum, and some big-time defensive pieces on the other side of the football. And it's like, we really don't return a whole lot, and now we're trying to work in a new head coach. So it leads me to believe that this might be a struggle bus a little bit for the Michigan Wolverines after winning a national title.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are expecting Michigan. They're definitely not expecting Michigan to come out and look like they did last year. I mean, you just lost too many pieces for that to be the case. But I think there are some people that are going to be surprised by how much Michigan might struggle this year. Like, this could be very well be a 7-5 team. Like, they have some pretty tough games on their schedule. They have to play Texas now. It's at home, but Texas is not a cakewalk.
No.
Games such as that where you could very easily look up
State.
Yeah, you could very easily look up through the season and be like, oh my God, Michigan's like 7-5 right now. What's going on? What happened to the Michigan? It was Jim Harbaugh holding the glue together. When in reality, the entire rug got swept out from underneath them. So it's going to be very difficult for Michigan this year, I believe. And I'm excited to see what they can do just because obviously the narrative is going to turn into, oh, now that Jim Harbaugh's not there and they can't cheat, it's going to be 7-5 and they're a mediocre team and they could only do this with the cheating. When in reality, they lost a ton.
Yeah, I think some keynote contributors that they do have returning is Will Johnson, the defensive back. He's a guy that's high up on people's draft boards already for the 2025 class, and he played phenomenal in the college football playoff, and that was a name that people were kind of like, ooh, that's a dang good football player. When watching Michigan play against Washington and Alabama this past season, Mason Graham, a defensive lineman, that's a big returnee for the Wolverines as well. So they do have some keynote guys on the defensive side of the football. I think it's just going to be for them figuring out their offensive identity. I would imagine that Chiron Moore just kind of continues what they did last year and try and continue that into this year. But it will be interesting to see kind of how that roster evolves and kind of how the game planning around them evolves, because what made Jim Harbaugh such a great head coach is he was able to develop these kind of work projects that he got off of the recruiting trail, these high school kids that maybe not a whole lot of teams were going after, and he took them and then he built them into these NFL draftable players. Whereas now, I don't know if Chiron Moore is going to be able to do that, and he might start recruiting some different style of players to kind of make up for that and make him a bit of a different college football program to watch. So going to be interesting to see how they fare this season. But again, I think it could be a significant drop off. TCU had one of these, but I feel like everybody already expected TCU to do that. I think people still kind of expect Michigan to be one of the upper tier programs in the Big Ten, and I don't think they're going to drop all the way to the bottom or anything like that, but I think there is a world where we see them in the middle of the pack.
Yeah, and the reality of it is also TCU is a fan base in a school that doesn't expect this kind of excellence year in and year out. Like the year that TCU had in 2022 was incredible, and the fans will forever remember that. If you don't win the national title as a Michigan fan, like you're disappointed. Like you expect national titles. So my question is kind of, How are Michigan fans going to treat Chiron Moore at the end of this year? Is it going to be like, hey, he was a big reason why we won it all in 2023. We need to give him time. We need to let him get his players in. We need to let him do his recruiting. Or is it going to be, well, the bus completely fell off the cliff as soon as he got here, so he's a problem?
I think you always, like the first year after a Natty, people give you some grace. Like, you still on that national championship high. You still have it you're still the reigning national champs throughout the entire season. You get to celebrate that with every home game. And that's how people are going to associate your program throughout the entire season. It's going to be the Michigan Wolverines, the reigning national champs of the 2023 season. Like, that still rings true throughout the entire season this next year. But once you start getting, the more and more distant you get from that national title, then the more impatient your fan base is going to be. But I think Michigan fans are aware of the situation. They understand that you just lost a lot of production. And let's be honest too, like, it's not like production and returning production is an indicator of if you're going to be competitive or not in the next year.
Exactly.
The 2 years that Georgia won the national title, they did not rank very high on the returning production list. I think they ranked like 81st the first year that they won it, and 95th the next year. So Georgia was a team that lost a lot of players to the NFL draft, and they were able to stack it up with great classes behind that. The only problem with Michigan is you haven't been recruiting at a top 3 level like Georgia had under Kirby Smart and continues to do so. You've kind of been recruiting in that top 15 range around there. So it's going to be a bit of a more uphill climb for you to establish that consistency, especially when you have a program like Ohio State, who just keeps, it seems like they've kind of just been picking up on the momentum, and this year feels like the one where they're going to slam dunk it on top of everybody.
Do they have win projections for Michigan coming into this year right now? Let me see
if I can find that right now.
Because I know that we were talking about how they released the win projections for a lot of teams, but I can't imagine you would put it over 9 for Michigan. And I mean, that even 9 feels really gracious just because you lost so much, and so many teams have a target on your back now. I think people kind of forget the way that 2023 season ended, and there's so much with the offseason and everything that kind of blew over, like how mad people were at Michigan because of the whole cheating scandal that went on. So you would have to imagine that people are going to be coming for Michigan this year, especially in the Big Ten.
Yeah, it's set at 9.5 for Michigan right now.
That makes sense. 9.5 seems about fair. And I mean, if they get to 9 wins, in my opinion, that's a good season under Chiron Moore.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the schedule right now just so we can kind of put some context around that. They have Fresno State at home to start the year. Then they have Texas at home after that.
Loss.
Arkansas State at home. USC at home, Minnesota at home, at Washington, at Illinois, Michigan State at home, Oregon at home, Indiana on the road, Northwestern at home, and then on the road at Ohio State. So they have a lot of favorable home games.
Yeah.
Some of their tough tests are at home, so that's good news. Like USC and Oregon, getting both of those at home, that's a big deal for you. But again, Oregon, that's kind of a little shaky. That honestly going to favor Oregon in that one. Ohio State going to favor them in that one. Washington, kind of, I mean, probably Michigan, you'd probably give the edge a little bit to Michigan now, just knowing what Washington just lost. I mean, you completely gutted that roster and that coaching staff this past offseason. So
Vegas is banking this off of them losing to Oregon, Texas, and Ohio State. Those are the 3 teams that they're kind of saying, all right, this is who they're going to lose to. That 0.5 is coming in and basically like, hey, they might be one of those teams, but they might also get upset by like a USC or something. So 9-3 is a very, very good season under Chiron Moore, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anywhere north of 8 wins, that's a fantastic season. I would say even if you just get to the 8-win mark, I think that's a serviceable season. Again, considering everything that has happened around that program and what you just had to go through during this offseason, I think that if you continue to just like stay in the positive, stay in the green with this program, then they're going to be on track and they're going to remain relatively competitive. But I mean, that you do add, again, Oregon into the conference and you added USC as well. So it only got tougher for you, but at the same time, you're still Michigan, you're still the reigning national champs, and there's still some goodness around that program.
All right, so do we have more win totals for other teams?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. So Georgia and Ohio State have the highest win total projections right now. Georgia's at 10.5. Wow. Ohio State's at 10.5, and Oregon as well is at 10.5, and alongside Texas as well. So there's 4 teams. Basically, that's who they're thinking is going to be the 4 teams, the 4 best teams in college football right now, which I think most people would agree with.
And they're all projected to at least lose 1 game.
Yes.
That's insane because, I mean, I think this year's going to be so much different than last year just because last year, obviously, there were 5 undefeated teams. Well, there were 4 undefeated teams. There were 5 going into the postseason. There's going to be so many. Like, we've had so many years in the past where it's like, hey, here's your 2 undefeated teams, and then here's the rest of 1-loss teams, and then there's the 2 lost teams that are off in the books. You had last year the huge problem of there's 5 undefeated teams right now going into the conference championship week. Someone has to lose. Someone's going to get screwed over. I don't think you're going to have this problem at all this year.
Yeah.
The scheduling and the conference realignment and the teams are going to have to play each other is too tough to where you're not going to have 12-0, 13-0 teams like an allotment of them and be like, oh shit, who we have to choose from?
Yeah, I think they're almost saying with Georgia and Texas, what they feel like might happen is whoever wins the regular season matchup between the two, like that's where they're gonna that'll be their only regular season loss for that team, and then they might get the rematch in the SEC championship game, and they get revenge and they avenge their loss to theirs, so that both of them would be only have one loss on the season. It's to one another. That's kind of the feel that I get from looking at these win totals.
Yeah, I really do think that it's surprising to see only 10.5 is the highest up there.
Yeah, nobody's saying 11.5. Nobody's saying a near perfect undefeated season. So I think everybody kind of feels like it is going to be a very different season.
Yeah. Or do we have any other win totals that are kind of interesting?
Alabama at 9.5.
Ooh, that's
Clemson at 9.5 as well.
So these, I mean, again, nine wins gets you in the playoff gets you as a fringe playoff team now if you're Alabama or Clemson.
Oh, you get to 10 wins as Alabama or Clemson. Well, it kind of depends on for Clemson. It's a little different than it would be Alabama probably. Like for Alabama, if your 2 losses are to Georgia and Oklahoma or something like that, then you would still probably be a playoff team. But for Clemson, if your 2 losses are to like Wake Forest and Louisville, that may not put you exactly in the top 12. Now, if you win the conference, obviously it would, but it's a little different. Those situations are a little different because your strength of schedule is a little different as well. Ole Miss is also another team with a 9.5 win total projection. Florida State at 9.5 as well, and then also LSU. So a lot of teams that they project to be at 9.5 wins.
So Clemson's at 10.5, Florida State's at 9.5. So obviously they have Clemson winning the ACC, correct? Or is it Clemson at 9.5?
They're both at 9.5.
Okay, that makes sense then. If you had to put money on one of those teams to hit the over, who would you pick?
Hit the over?
Yeah.
Golly. That's a really tough one because typically in these situations, I would go with the better head coach and I would go with the better quarterback.
But you don't know who that is.
I don't really know who's the better quarterback between Klubnik and DJU, and I really don't know who's the better coach right now.
And you can do any of the teams.
Mike Norvell.
You can do Ohio State, you can do Georgia, any of those teams that you think will hit the overs.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, your gut tells you Georgia's because they have Kirby Smart, they have a 5th-year quarterback, but
yeah,
then
you get the best coach.
But then you look at that schedule and it's like, well, they have to travel to Texas, they have to travel to Tuscaloosa, they have to travel to Ole Miss, and that's just 3 games. Like they still have to play Tennessee, they still have to play some really tough schedule. They still have to play Clemson. I know people are saying that's not a super tough game now, but there's a lot. I mean, Ohio State's another team where it's kind of like maybe
that's probably who I'd feel the most comfortable saying gets over the 10.5 win mark. I think Ohio State. It's easier for me to see them winning 11 games than it is even for Texas and Georgia, and that's not a reflection again on the Longhorns or the Bulldogs. It's more so a reflection of you got to go through a really tough schedule and a really tough conference for you to get to that mark. So that's more so the reason why I would say I feel a lot more comfortable in Ohio State.
Yeah, Ohio State opens the season with Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall, Michigan State, which isn't a challenge anymore. I mean, their first real game is Iowa in Columbus, and that's the first week of October.
Yeah.
Then it's Oregon, Nebraska, Penn State, Purdue, Northwestern. So, I mean, that's a pretty tough 3-game run.
So even if you lose to Oregon, you still get to 11 wins, you know? So that's why I feel like if it's going to be anybody right now that I feel comfortable saying, it'd be Ohio State.
And that's why expectations in the heat on pressure on Ryan Day is so high right now, because you've assembled the Avengers for your roster and you're not playing super difficult teams. Yeah, you still have Oregon. Yeah, you still have Michigan, but they're all down, it seems. Well, not Oregon as much, but Michigan's down this year. So
I'll tell you what, the win total projections are very high on the Big Ten because they have Penn State at 9.5, they have Michigan at 9.5, they have Ohio State at 9.5. So those 3 teams, they feel like are all going to be hovering around that 10-win projection mark.
Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, 3 of probably the most disliked programs in all of college football.
Yeah.
But that got us thinking on a different segment today and kind of what we thought would be interesting. Who do you think is the Mount Rushmore of people hated in college football? Not just people, but figures.
People and figures hated in college football.
Like when you think of a person or a figure in college football, what is the automatic consensus, obviously other than their fan base, that they suck, they hate them, they wish nothing but no success?
I think first and foremost, the NCAA. I mean, everybody. That's one that I feel like a majority of people in college football can get around.
That's fair.
Now, there's some talking points as to why you shouldn't have so much hatred towards the NCAA, but understandably, every single college football fan would understand why you dislike the NCAA and why you hate them. I feel like every single college football fan does have some type of hatred towards the NCAA. So they would be the first person that I put on the Mount Rushmore for most hated in college football. Right behind there, I had Baker Mayfield. I feel like even if you didn't play Baker Mayfield during his time at Oklahoma, just seeing him plant the flag in the midfield at Ohio State, you either loved it or you absolutely hated it. It was kind of like a Johnny Manziel vibe. Right. But I feel like Baker Mayfield was a little more... how do I put this? A little bit more emotional with it, a little more outspoken with it. And just kind of his antics, a little bit like grabbing his junk on the other sidelines after scoring a touchdown. Like, it was some epic moments, and it was an exciting time of college football, and he was exciting to watch. But I feel like a majority of college football fans did not like him.
I feel like Baker Mayfield was probably one of the last polarizing players that we've had in the sport of college football. Like, everyone liked Joe Burrow. Everyone liked Trevor Lawrence. I'm trying to think of who was another big star. Like, people, maybe Caleb Williams.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Caleb Williams kind of got there, but I wouldn't say to, like, this point of, like, just again, because if you didn't like Caleb Williams, it's because you just didn't like him painting his nails or him crying on after a game. Like, those things kind of just rubbed you the wrong way, or him doing photo shoots. For Baker, it was like everything on the football field that you didn't like about him. It was the cockiness that he played with and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. What others do you have?
I have Brian Bosworth. That's kind of a callback one. That, you know, that he was also one that got in trouble with the NCAA a little bit with the drug test, and then he wore the shirt that said the National Communist. I can't remember the exact abbreviation that said on the shirt, but basically a big F you to the NCAA. But I also think that there's a fan base, there's a group of people that also love Brian Bosworth because everybody loves him, a nasty, dirty defensive player that is just gritty and he gets after and he'll take someone's head off. And he was just one of those old school linebacker type style players that people really liked and enjoyed to watch. But there's also a group of people that probably did not like him.
He's also gotten back in the good graces of fans, I think, with these Fansville commercials as the sheriff of Dr. Pepperville or whatever it's called.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, there's a whole generation that didn't grow up knowing him as the boss, the linebacker with the collar that played for Oklahoma and the Seahawks. Like, now he's just, that's the sheriff for Dr. Pepper commercial. So I don't know if he's necessarily one you can put on Mount Rushmore just because of that, just because of what he's done in the past.
There is some likeness about him, like the mohawk and things like that. I mean, those things are pretty cool. I think me as a kid, I think I might have actually liked Brian Bosworth a little bit. And then the last one, this is such a layup, but you got to hit your layups. And this one is so easy, I really don't even have to give you justification for it. But Jerry Sandusky, you mess with children, that's an automatic. You are a hated person, and you deserve every single piece of hate that you have coming your way.
Yeah, don't diddle kids.
And then I have an honorable mention. I have Ed O'Bannon. He's the former UCLA basketball player that ultimately it resolved in the college video games being discontinued and no longer being available to play. So, I mean, now it's okay because the video games are coming back and we get those things back. But during that time, like when it happened, I would imagine there was a whole lot of hatred towards his way.
Yeah, I agree with those. I had trouble narrowing my list down to 4 because I got to thinking about it. There's a lot of people in the college football world that were extremely polarizing, that were even hated. Like, I mean, I think Cam Newton, people forget how much Cam Newton was hated during that 2010 season. Yeah. Especially after everything that came out with, did his dad accept money to go to Auburn and things such as that. I think Cam Newton makes a really good argument for that, but his time in college football was so short, or the spotlight at least was so short-lived, that I don't think you can really say he's on the Mount Rushmore of hate. I also think Johnny Manziel is kind of like this as well, because you had one year where Johnny Manziel was loved. That freshman phenom, oh my God, the freshman came in and beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Like, everyone loved Johnny Manziel the first year. It wasn't until the offseason after he won the Heisman, and then that second year where people really start like, oh, this guy's an asshole. So Johnny Manziel and Cam Newton are two people that I think were really hated, but I don't know if they go on Mount Rushmore.
I would say for Cam Newton, part of the reason why people probably didn't like him is any fan base that has ever played a player that you just can't stop and he absolutely dominates your team, you have some hatred towards that player because it's like, how the heck can we not stop this guy? We know exactly what he's going to do and we still can't stop him. And if he just beats your team into an oblivion, like those are the types of players that fans ends up hating because it's like, gosh, he always gave us fits. And while it was short-lived, it wasn't like he was around college football and dominated college football for 3 years. That 1 year, he was so impactful and so notable that people, I think, did grow to dislike him a little bit. Plus, too, like the allegations and criminal activity, a little bit of being kicked out of Florida and things like that. That doesn't help the cause either. Yeah, I think what has helped his cause, though, he's given so much back to his community now that like people look more back like Cam Newton as kind of a positive figure in the Atlanta area for sure. So that's why I didn't have him up there. But I mean,
two people that I think definitely deserve to be up there: Bobby Petrino and Art Browse. Like, we don't really need to go into why they're up there. Bobby Petrino and Art Browse. You could even throw Urban Meyer on this list as someone who it's like.
I almost put Urban Meyer.
I think Urban Meyer is very, very easily one of the top most hated figures in college football. But the problem is that he kind of has three fan bases that love him. Mm-hmm. Utah, Florida, and Ohio State. Like, they're always going to ride or die for Urban because of what he brought to their programs. I think another player who was kind of hated in there, who's kind of been loved now but hated at their time, was Jameis Winston. Like, Jameis Winston's now known as like that goofy guy that says all this outlandish things.
People
like,
love him now.
Yeah, well, let's eat a W, and he's dancing in the crutches in the Saints locker room. But people hated Jameis Winston at first. I mean, after, you know, he had the allegations going into that Heisman season, and then 2014, that stuff came out, and he was suspended for standing on the table and screaming something. So Jameis Winston was probably one of the other people that belong around Rushmore.
And again, it's these type of people that are outspoken and very characteristic, and they're not afraid or shy of the cameras, and they really have no filter to themselves. So those are the people that kind of rub people the wrong way. They rub fans the wrong way. And if you're an opposing team, if you play them that year, like, you're probably not going to like Jameis Winston. But I think an important thing to know is something you just kind of touched on as well, is that a lot of these people have had time to kind of do a clean slate, wipe themselves clean, and put them in a more shining light and put themselves in a better spotlight over their careers. Like, I'd say more people now love Baker Mayfield more than they did in college, because now,
I mean, you do State Farm or Progressive commercials, like,
and then he's playing for the Tampa Bay Bucks, and the Bucks are kind of like this underdog a little bit in the playoffs, and he's winning football games, and he's kind of rewriting his career after things ended out in Cleveland. And then also too, like, I think he's not on any of our lists, but another player like this is Tim Tebow. I think people did not like Tim Tebow when he was in college, but now that he's doing great things in the community and he's on SEC Nation every day and he's got this great personality to him, people don't necessarily not like Tim Tebow anymore. They just kind of respect him and like who he is, because he's not doing anything wrong. He's just showing love for college football and showing love to other people. So it's hard to hate on that.
I avoided putting Tim Tebow on this list because I think Tim Tebow, like you said earlier, was a guy who was hated not because of what he did off the field or how he was or how his personality. He was hated because, like you said, no one could seem to stop him.
Yeah.
Like, that's why you hated Tim Tebow. And it's frustrating to have a player like that, but everyone, I felt like, respected Tim Tebow, especially while he was there, and especially after the fact, all the things he's done. So,
well, and anybody that has this perception about them that they're this perfect golden child and they can't do anything wrong and they don't do anything wrong, everybody's like, there's something shady about this guy. Like, no way you keep your nose that clean at a place like the University of Florida. You're the number one player in college football. You win the Heisman. You win a national title. Like, you're telling me that you just sit in your dorm room every day and you read your Bible and lift weights and you're just great and nice to everybody? Like, there's no way that you can be that good of a person, right?
Yeah, I mean, for whatever, it hasn't been proven wrong. It's been 15 years since he played there almost, and he's still one of the most beloved figures and still looked at as a role model for everyone. I do have one person who I question should belong on this list. Now, the thing is, they've only been in the college football realm for 1 year, essentially. But they might have done just enough to become one of the most hated.
That quick, huh?
Ever. Like, is Deion Sanders already on the Mount Rushmore of hated coaches or hated figures in college football?
Deion is certainly a polarizing figure because you either love him or you don't like him at all. Or for me, like, I'm kind of in between both of those. Like, there's things that I respect about Deion, and there's things that I think that you should absolutely not handle. You should handle totally different. Like, tweeting at football players and getting in the middle of social media drama. Shouldn't be doing those things as a head coach. Like, there's some things I'm like, dude, come on. Like, what are we doing? But again, also things that I respect about him. So I think it's still a little too early to tell because it has only been 1 year at Colorado. I know he's been a head coach for multiple years now, but I'd like to see some more, and let's see how things play out at Colorado. Like, if he sticks things out past his sons going to the NFL and he really helps build up Colorado and they become a contender, and, you know, he cleans things up a little bit, then I would say no. He's probably not going to be one of the most hated people, but he very well, it could go either way. You know, it could continue to like go down this other path, or you could go down this path where people like you and people love you and people love how you treated college football, and people think that you kind of helped the sport out a little bit during a time when it was needed.
Yeah, I also think that he really runs the risk of not being taken seriously if he keeps pumping out 500 teams.
Yeah.
Like, if Colorado goes 6-6 this year and say he stays around and they go maybe 7-5 next year, the media is not going to circle around him as much because last year obviously was fun. It was new. They started out 3-0 or 4-0, whatever it was. Like, hey, Colorado might be really something here. Deion might be turning it around. But if they're 6-6 at the end of 2024, I think people are kind of out on the Deion train and just start to not even hate him as much, just show apathy to him.
Well, especially this year, like if you don't have any type of success this year and you know you're losing Shadur and you know you're losing Travis Hunter and you're losing some other key pieces to your roster, like I don't think people are going to, and that's what I'm really interested to see is like, how is business handled there when your children aren't around and you don't have this 5-star Travis Hunter on your team anymore and you don't have your all-star quarterback anymore? Like, how do things look then and how are you doing business around then? I would imagine that he remains pretty consistent because he's always remained consistent in things, but things can change, and I would imagine that would create a lot of change of not having some of those players on your roster anymore.
They have an insane week 1 game, like a week 1 game that's a head scratcher.
Who are they playing? Like a ranked team?
No, they're playing a team that's not ranked. North Dakota State University.
Ooh.
Now, for those who don't really know, North Dakota State is a kind of known around college football as
the Alabama of the FCS.
That for sure, but not even that. Like the team that you do not want to play. Like when you're scheduling non-Power 5 opponents, it's like, hey, we need to pay a team to get some easy money. There's 2 teams, I think, in my opinion, 3 that you never schedule. Army, any other service academy, and North Dakota State. Because the way they play football and the way that they play, or the way that they grind you out is so hard, and it wears you down so much to the point where you can look up and you're in a 1-score game against a very, very not formidable opponent.
Yeah, any team that runs a triple option, and you know Kirby Smart in Georgia has always talked about this of when they ran the triple option under Paul Johnson of, you know, throughout an entire season we have to game plan for when we play Georgia Tech at the very end of the season because you never see the triple option. You have to continue to implement it into your practice sessions because you have to be ready for it. And so, but Georgia did that every single year. They knew that Georgia Tech was going to be on their schedule every single year. Whereas if you just randomly go and schedule Army or one of the service academies, it's like for 1 year you got to play the triple option, and it's something you're not prepared for. And a lot of times, like if you get behind, if you get down 2 scores against someone like them, they just are going to milk the clock, kill the clock, and they're going to keep you from getting the football. And there's really not anything you can do about it. But North Dakota State is an interesting one for Colorado because of all the teams you could have scheduled in the FCS, why would you schedule the one team over there that could potentially beat you? Like you could potentially start your season by losing to North Dakota State. You want to talk about just an absolute implosion and defamation to your season as quick as it starts? That'd be Colorado losing to North Dakota State.
And not to mention this, the risk isn't worth the reward. If you go out and you beat Colorado State, fine. It's North Dakota State. If you go out and you beat North Dakota State, fine. It's North Dakota State. They're not a D1 team. They're not a FBS team. You should beat them. You're Deion Sanders in Colorado. Like there's no reward to this. Like even if Colorado goes out and beats them by 30, just drums them, no one's gonna go, oh wow, hey, Colorado really beat North Dakota State. Well, that was a really solid win. There might be some CFB experts, but the public consensus is going to be that's what you should have done.
Yeah, that's the expectation.
No one congratulates Alabama when they beat University of Charlotte by 45 points. That's what you should have done. That's the expectation. Now, if you come out and lose, which is very possible because North Dakota State's a very, very talented team, all of a sudden you are getting all this heat towards you because, hey, that's a team you should beat. They're not even Power 5. They're not even FBS. Why are you losing to them, Deion? So he's opened the door once again for more hate and more attention. Now, but the adverse of this is that the hate and attention you bring isn't going to be given to you if you do something positive. Like, Deion brought so much attention onto him that when they started 4-0, they made it to the top 15, I think. They cracked the top 15 as rankings just because the buzz around them was so built up. And the teams that they played were so notable. I mean, they beat TCU, for God's sakes, a team that played in the national championship the game before. So the idea that now you're going to go and play North Dakota State, a team that in reality doesn't have clout, and put a risk that you have a risk of losing to them, I just don't think it's very safe.
Yeah, I love
or smart.
I loved Pete Thamel's quote about this game. He said, "Whoever scheduled that game should be fired," because it's exactly what you're talking about. Is the risk and reward, like those two things compared to one another, it's on polar opposite ends of the spectrum. Like there's two different things, and again, like. If you lose the game, then people are going to start writing you off. There's going to be questions about Deion as a head coach. But if you win the game, then it's okay. Well, good. Like that's what you were supposed to do. Like there's no difference. We have no different outlook of you as a program than we did 24 hours ago.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, this really has to be the year that you succeed if you're Colorado. Because you're losing Travis Hunter, most likely. You're losing Shedeur. Like, the future for Colorado isn't super bright coming into this season. But there are a couple of teams that have a bright outlook on as the future goes on. Who was it put this out? ESPN put out an article today that college football teams that have the brightest futures on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I thought this was an interesting article to talk about, just kind of looking forward to college football, specifically like this year and a couple of years in advance. And so ESPN did their due diligence of ranking some of these teams in order of who has the brightest future offensively in college football. And I don't think that you were able to look at the list, so we thought it'd be fun to do a little blind reacting. So Kirby's going to be reacting to this list the same time that you guys are. And so I'll just kind of start reading off some of the names, and we can kind of create some talking points around each one, whether we agree or disagree. And number 1 is Ohio State.
That doesn't surprise me. And I mean, they've got like 5 quarterbacks in their room that are former 5 stars or super highly talented transfers.
Yeah. I mean, between this year with Will Howard, then you also have Julian Sayin, and you have Aaron Noland in your quarterback room as well. Devin Brown is still hanging around as well. And so not even this year of what you have, but moving forward, like Jeremiah Smith is just a true freshman, so you know that you're going to have some offensive firepower there hanging around. Running back situation will be a little interesting moving forward because you have Quinshon Judkins and you have Travion Henderson this year, but you're not going to have them next year more than likely. So I think that they do have a bright future when you just look at it from the quarterback spot and you look at it from Jeremiah Smith, and you know that they're going to recruit wide receivers well every single year. So from that standpoint, I understand it. And the 2 biggest factors in an offense being successful quarterback and wide receivers in this era of football. So to me, that one also made sense.
Yeah, and plus the big bad defense that's given you problems the last 3 years and put you in a box is no more. Like Jim Harbaugh's not there. That defensive scheme, they can still run it, but it's not going to be executed the same way, especially not with the players they have. So future is very bright for the Ohio State offense.
Number 2 is Texas.
Makes sense. You've got Quinn, you've got Arch, and they've got Sark, who's one of the best offensive minds in college football.
Yeah, and you also have Ryan Wingo. He was a 5-star wide receiver from this last class as well. So they're kind of beefing up that roster a little bit. That's going to be a keynote player to watch for them this year and moving forward as well. I'm sure that him and Arch Manning are going to be quite buddy-buddy over the next couple of years when Arch Manning does take over as a starter. And then you also have CJ Baxter, the running back. Like, you got a good running back room. So again, it also makes sense. You got you hit the nail on the head with, you have Sark, an offensive mastermind, and then you have the future at the quarterback room.
Yeah, as long as you have Sark calling your plays, your future is always going to be right at the offensive room. Because 1, he recruits well on offense. 2, he draws up deadly schemes. I mean, that 2020 Alabama season where he was offensive coordinator was insane.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 3 is Georgia. That's where Georgia falls in. They're right behind Texas and Ohio State.
Yeah, I mean, that also makes sense. Like, every smart recruits at an elite level. Georgia's got kind of this stacked quarterback room now. And oh, by the way, they've got an offensive coordinator who's extremely talented, despite what that fan base might think, who probably isn't going anywhere. He's dipped his toe into the head coaching realm. He's a Georgia guy through and through. Like, I don't think that you're going to lose Mike Bubba to a head coaching job anytime soon.
I would agree with that as well. Obviously, you check all the boxes in the quarterback room, especially after you just got Jaden Rashada. You have Ryan Puglisi in there. You have Gunnar Stockton after this year when Carson Beck goes to the NFL. And then you also have Ryan Montgomery committed for the next class. So your quarterback room is loaded down already. You check the boxes there. You just got 3 running backs, or really 2 running backs out of this last recruiting class. So Nate Frazier being one of them and Chauncey Bones being the other. So you have the running back room that's beefed up. You have another year of Roddick Robinson at least after this year. He's just a sophomore. Really the only question, and probably the reason why Georgia's at 3, is because you don't have the 5-star wide receivers just yet. Now you have the tight end room absolutely loaded down because of Todd Hartley and the way that he recruits that room. So there's no questions there. So you make up for what you lack in the wide receiver room and the tight end room. But if you did have one of these 5-star wide receivers, I would honestly imagine that Georgia might even be number 1 on this list.
Yeah, I mean, the 5-star wide receiver is kind of the joke that Georgia has, the last infinity stone. So once they are able to fully start really recruiting those, which I don't know if they'll ever be able to the way they do their NIL packaging and paying players, but it'll be very, very scary once Georgia can finally lock down highly talented, elite upper echelon cream of the crop receiver talent.
Absolutely. Oregon comes in at number 4.
I mean, with what Dan Lanning has done the past 2 years, with the past two different OCs for Bo Nix, a guy that was, for all extents and purposes, kind of washed coming out of Auburn. I mean, it makes sense to me. And it's Oregon. You're always going to have high speed. You're always going to have elite talent on that offensive side of the ball just because of the brand recognition.
Yeah, and I mean, having Dylan Gabriel this year, Dante Moore right behind him, that was a surprise that Dan Lanning was able to get both of those guys out of this year's transfer portal. That was a big win for Lanning and the Oregon Ducks. And then you have Evan Stewart coming from Texas A&M as a wide receiver. That's a weapon that you're adding to a room that just lost Troy Franklin to the NFL, so you make up for it there. But yeah, talking about what he did for Bo Nix and what he was able to do with 2 offensive coordinators, it makes you feel comfortable that you feel like Oregon's offensive success is going to continue upon years upon end. And again, having not only this year Dylan Gabriel, but Dante Moore right behind him, who was a former top quarterback recruit in the country, things are looking very bright for Oregon moving forward offensively. Number 5 is Alabama.
I mean, it's Alabama. They've recruited well forever. I know you don't have Nick Saban there who's doing the recruiting heavy lifting for you now, but you have Kalen DeBoer, a guy who proved that he's got one of the better offensive minds in college football and can assemble a team that beats world beaters and also develop wide receivers and quarterbacks. I mean, I don't think people remember that Michael Penix on Indiana wasn't bad. He was not the Michael Penix you saw in Washington. Now, playing college football for 6 and 7 years helps that a little bit, but what Kalen DeBoer was able to do for Michael Penix was very impressive, and it makes sense as to why. And yeah, Alabama's just always going to recruit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that 5 may be the right place. I think they have a lot of names in their quarterback room, but it's Dylan Lonergan, it's Ty Simpson, and it's Austin Mack, the guy that they brought over from Washington. So you got a lot of bodies in there, a lot of good bodies. You have Justice Haynes at the running back position. That's obviously a good one to have. The wide receiver room of all things is a little bit has some questions in it. You bring in Ryan Williams this year, which is one of the top wide receivers from this last class. That's a big guy that's going to have to be an impact player for them. But outside of that, it's like Kobe Prentice and Kendrick Law, like those guys are going to have to prove themselves and be some big time targets for Jalen Milroe this next season and moving forward. So of all things, the wide receiver room is probably what's holding Alabama back from being like inside the top 4. But number 5, it's not a bad place to be. And as of right now, I'm fine with it, especially when you think about Kalen DeBoer and the offenses that he's had over the past couple of years. Right after that is USC and Lincoln Riley.
Makes sense. Look at, I mean, we're at the point now where it starts to speak for itself. Look at what Lincoln Riley has done with literally every quarterback he's had. Number 1 pick, or at least a first-round pick. Jalen Hurts is the one exception there. Heisman contender, number 1 pick, high-powered offense. The question's always going to be, can Lincoln Riley get it done on defense? So the future's always going to be bright under USC with Lincoln Riley at the helm. It's a question is, what's the team outlook going to be, and can we get our defense to get their shit together? The answer's been no thus far, but they'll be fine. I mean, they have Zachariah Branch. I'd have to assume that you'd have to assume Juju Lewis is going to end up going there now that Georgia's taken their guy in 2025. So, like, you're going to see a lot of talent come through USC. You're going to see a lot of good play calls by Lincoln Riley. The future is always bright on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think this is more so putting in stock in Lincoln Riley than it is like the current situation with the Trojans. I mean, you have Miller Moss this year, and I think it is important to note that you do have Jaden Mayava. This is the kid from UNLV that committed to Georgia, decommitted, and then he quickly committed to USC. So they do have him on the roster. That's a guy that stuffed up the stat sheet for UNLV. He was one of the top quarterbacks in the portal when he went in. And then also Julian Lewis is on the cusp of arriving on campus, assuming that his commitment stays intact. So the quarterback room has a bright future, and you got some good arms in there, and you will have some great arms in that room, as you typically will for USC. And then also I think it's worth noting too that Deuce Robinson at USC, that's the tight end again that almost came to Georgia and ultimately went to USC. That's a great athlete and a great target to have. And you also have Zachariah Branch this season as well, but you also lost Brendan Rice and Taj Washington and Marshawn Lloyd, your running back. So the offense, probably there's never really a whole lot of questions with Lincoln Riley's offense. You never really have to question too much of if they're going to be good or not. But the future probably not looking as bright at USC right now as it has in years past for Lincoln Riley.
Probably not, and that's obviously because the quarterback talent necessarily isn't there. You have more questions, I think, is one of the bigger things. And also with coming into the Big Ten, you're going to have to play more defenses. Like Lincoln Riley went from the Big 12, where defense wasn't really a thing, to the Pac-12, which was kind of labeled as one of these softer programs or softer conferences at the time. So I think the Big Ten is going to be his first real step against consistently playing defenses that are tough.
LSU comes in at number 7, right behind USC.
That's fair. I mean, the talent LSU has is always kind of like the talent you see there. There's always an influx of it, and the wide receiver core that they put out in the last 5 years has been incredible as well.
Yeah, I mean,
They also have 2 offensive tackles that I believe are NFL guys.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The offensive line is there. They have protection for them, but that's for this year. So, I mean, looking for 2024, that's a great thing to have. But moving forward, it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. If you lose Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors as your wideouts, you're going to have to replace those, and you also lose Jaden Daniels. But you bring in Garrett Nussmeier, and I think, if anything, where the future lies for LSU and where I think a lot of people are excited to see where this offense heads for the Tigers is Bryce Underwood, the number 1 quarterback in the for the quarterback class this next year. He's committed to LSU, and I mean, that's just a special playmaker in itself. That he screams LSU Heisman potential player already in high school. So I think more than anything, that's kind of what they're rooting the future in LSU's offense in. But Brian Kelly has proven over the last 2 years that he can create a high-powered offense and one that can compete with the best of them. And if he continues to do that in year 3, then that's something that we're going to have to be associating Brian Kelly with for the foreseeable future.
Apparently, chat's talking about some more static again. If you want to check that off, so I'll do what are we on number 8? Number 8 is the Tennessee. Number 8 is the Tennessee Volunteers. So that makes sense to me as well, just because Josh Heupel, what he did for Tennessee in the last few years. I mean, making that program essentially relevant again with what he did with Hendon Hooker, and even though Joe Milton wasn't exactly what you thought he was going to be at the start of the year, he ended up being a very solid and formidable quarterback for Tennessee, better than what they've had in years past. So obviously with Nico coming in, Nico Amlieva, I think I got it.
Just start calling him Nico. I think that's what
Nico. I'm so tempted to go full name though, but with Nico there, the future seems very bright. Tennessee's recruiting really good with wide receivers too. I think they got a 5-star, what was his name, Mike Matthews this year. Mm-hmm. So they've got a lot of talent coming in. It makes sense as to why the outlook is so good for them.
Yeah. So guys, we're having to charge batteries and put them back in. I think we're at this point where both sets of batteries have just a little bit of juice to where it can stay on for a little bit, and then it's going to cut off. So just keep doing what you guys are doing. Let us know when the static comes up. We'll go switch the batteries out. Sorry for the inconvenience. Should have had them charged up and made sure that was good to go before the show, but we failed on that part. But we appreciate you guys being patient with us and continue to stick with us throughout the show. Speaking of the show and continuing another great hour into Talk the Dog as we'll wrap it up, I think you made some great points about Tennessee that I absolutely agree with. So we went over the top 8 brightest futures for the offense.
Is there 9 and 10? Do we just want to blow through those real quick?
Yeah, we can say 9 and 10 real quick. Oklahoma comes in at number 9.
That's interesting.
And then also number 10 is Michigan.
Also interesting. That's more off the brand name than anything, I believe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But yeah, we got a whole nother hour coming up. Stay tuned. We're going to talk some dog here in a little bit.
Welcome into Talk the Dog, the show where we find a bone to pick and a take to give. These are not hot takes. These is dog takes. Can I talk that dog?
What's up? You really like that?
Let's shut up and grind some tape.
Welcome in to Talk That Dog with us. We got a whole nother hour of Georgia-based content for all of you dog fans. We forgot to do this in the first hour, so we'll go ahead and take care of business right now in the second hour. We got prize picks. You need to head over there right now, 100% deposit match using promo code Brooks. There's so many great plays over there, guys, between the NBA playoffs. You Georgia fans, Anthony Edwards, he's balling. He's repping the dogs really well in the NBA right now, one of the best players in the league. Go hit on his prize picks bets. I mean, anytime that you can hit over on his points per game, that's free money right there. So again, promo code Brooks, prize picks. Go do that today. Support the business. Support prize picks. They support us. Thank you for doing that. But again, we're here in the Talk the Dog hour, and we got a loaded show for you. We don't have Brooks here to say that, so I'll take care of business there as well and saying that we do have a loaded one for you guys. And we'll do the same thing that we did in the first hour. And we'll go ahead and talk about week 1, Kirby. So week 1, time slots were announced. Georgia versus Clemson in the bins. And it's a noon kickoff. What was your reaction?
Noon kick. Another noon kick, huh? Man. Obviously, you don't want that. Obviously, Kirby Smart loves it. He loves having noon kicks. I don't know if he loves it as much when he's traveling on the road. It is frustrating, and there's kind of this stigma that, oh, Georgia always gets the scraps. Georgia always has the bad time slots. After they won the Natty their first year, they didn't have a single night game at home, things such as that. So I do understand the gripe and the kind of the complaints that you have as a Georgia fan as to why the hell is this game at noon. It's a top 25 matchup. It's between two out-of-conference teams. It's at a neutral site. It should be one of the more exciting matchups in college football. Why the hell is it at noon? And then the more you think about it, well, one, I think it says a lot about how people are predicting this game to go. Vegas has already kind of given Clemson, like 15-point underdogs at this point. Vegas doesn't think this game's going to be close. ESPN and the networks clearly don't think this game's going to be close. Otherwise, they put it on prime time. So I think it's kind of looking like Georgia is just coming out and being predicted to beat the shit out of Clemson.
And you think that's probably why they put it at noon? That's kind of what you'd
have to think. Like, if you felt very confident that even though these teams are ranked inside the top 15, I believe, even though you had a top 15 matchup between two programs that have each won a Natty in the last 7 years, the fact that you have a chance, or there's a probability that this game is a 20-point victory in the favor of one team, would you want that being your primetime game?
Probably not.
So I think that's kind of what networks are going for. And oh, by the way, we talked about it earlier in the National Hour. It's a good week one slate.
Yeah, that's
like, this isn't the only glaring light. I'm like, hey, this is the only game we can kind of look forward to. You've got Florida, Miami. You've got Notre Dame, Texas A&M. Like, there are some big marquee matchups in this week one schedule that would kind of justify putting this at noon, I think.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think it makes sense to put Georgia and Clemson at noon almost because Miami and Florida are playing at 3:30, and then right after that, you have Notre Dame and Texas A&M. These are all games that are being played on ABC for week one. So why would you not stack these games up like they did? And I think it makes sense because all the other noon games at this time, like Clemson and Georgia, is going to be the biggest noon game anyways. That's the game that everybody's probably going to be watching. So draw in that noon crowd and get everybody tuning in from a money standpoint. Like from a business side of things, I think it makes complete sense. But also for me, like, I kind of like noon games. I've kind of almost grown to like them as a Georgia fan. We get them so much that I've honestly kind of like, you know what, it's not too bad. You get to watch your game in the beginning. Like, for us, we get to we take care of business the first during the first time slot of the day, and then after that you get to watch the 3:30 games, you get to watch the 7:30 games, and you get to watch the 10:30 games, and you just get to enjoy the rest of your day, and you get home in a timely manner as well.
You sound so old right now.
Well, I did just graduate, so I don't have the outlook of a student anymore. I have to grow up a little bit, mature.
YouTube Chad's about to cook you for that. I appreciate a good noon game when it's kind of the appetizer for your first game. When it's the main game that you're going to go to, it's the game you're going to cover, that's going to be the only game you watch throughout the day, it kind of stinks. And it's also, there's kind of this reputation with being a noon game. It's like, oh, those are the games that don't really matter as much. So when you throw a game like this into a noon slot, it's kind of saying, this isn't as important. I feel like that's how fans are viewing it. But Fox has kind of struck gold with their big noon kick. I think ESPN and CBS and all those conglomerates kind of saw that and said, wait a minute, we should try to skew over to that more and take advantage of this untapped market, because big noon kick has been a success in my opinion. Yeah. So I think that's also what you're starting to see here.
Well, I think what's great for big noon kick is that, they have their Fox game day show, and it leads directly into the big noon kickoff game. And now ESPN's going to get to do the same thing where you're watching ESPN College Game Day, and that's going to directly lead you into ESPN's ABC noon game. And I think they do want to compete with the big noon kickoff, and I think that's probably why you're seeing Georgia and Clemson slid in at this noon slot. But again, I think that noon games, they aren't that bad. Now, when it is like Georgia versus Tennessee State at noon, it's like, that one's kind of like, that one sucks a little bit. It was kind of cool when they did UT Martin and Georgia at night, because at least that was a night game. And especially early on in the year, I will say this, being in Sanford Stadium at noon early on in the season, that sucks. Yes. That is absolutely brutal. But then too, like, I thought about this is, I don't know if you've ever been to Mercedes-Benz for a game day, whether it's the Atlanta Falcons or for a college football game. The tailgating scene isn't exactly great. No, it's not very accessible. They shut off a lot of things because they want you to go to the CNN Center and all these other places. They want you to spend your money there. They don't want you on the grounds tailgating all day like they do in these other college towns. So maybe it's not the worst thing that this was at noon, because you can't really tailgate anyways.
Yeah, I think people are starting to grow tired of the neutral site games, and I think that's probably the fact that you had the 12 o'clock kickoff. That was kind of the icing on top of the cake. I have a hypothetical or a would you rather for you, but I feel like I know the answer now that you've kind of talked about how much you enjoy noon kickoffs now. But would you rather this game be played prime time in Atlanta? So you still get to you still have to go to the Bends. It's still, but it's
prime time as in 7:30.
7:30 kick. So it's a prime time game. You get to watch all the others before you can tailgate. Maybe it's not gonna be hot as hell outside when you're walking to the stadium.
It is in the dome.
Or would you rather be the game played in Sanford but it's still a noon kick. I feel like I know your answer now because you talked about how much you enjoy noon kicks, but I think that's kind of the fair trade-off on here.
Man, if I wish they would have done a true home and home with Georgia and Clemson when they scheduled these matchups, because when they did it 10 years ago, when they did it in 2013 and 2014, those environments, when Georgia had to travel to Death Valley and then when Clemson had to come to Georgia, like those environments were unmatched, and it was great ways to open up the season. Like I can still remember when Todd Gurley returned the kickoff against Clemson and how nuts the stadium went. And the same thing for Clemson when they beat Georgia the year prior. Like those are environments that you look forward to because it's so rare that you get them. So I'm going to say noon, only not because I somewhat enjoy noon games, but because those are such unique environments that you hardly ever get access to. And Clemson and Georgia, while they're in separate conferences and they don't play each other as regularly as fans would like them to, it is somewhat of a rivalry. Like there is some dislike between these two teams.
It was in the 80s. There's a deep history in the 80s, I believe.
Yeah, so I think that they would just provide a great atmosphere. Whether that game is at 10 a.m., 8 p.m., or midnight, like that's going to be one of the best environments ever. I think it's still going to be somewhat of a good environment in Mercedes-Benz because it's going to be the opening week and it's in the state of Georgia. So it's essentially like a home game for Georgia, and Clemson's not too far up the road either. So there's going to be quite a few Tiger fans that travel down as well. So I think it'll still be a pretty good environment. But if you could have had this one at home, like without a doubt, you got to take it.
Yeah, my answer will almost always be let regular season games be played at home.
Yeah.
Neutral site venues have not ever been exciting, with the exception of the Rose Bowl. That's the one exception. Every other venue is kind of like, all right, cool, we get to play in a neutral site game. So doing it in the regular season, I've never understood. You take away from the fans, in my opinion. You're not allowing true college football fans to go to games. Obviously, there are still fans in the stadiums. They still pack them out. Dogs travel well, but taking that away from Sanford, or not even that, play it in Clemson, play it in Death Valley. Like taking that away from home fans and giving teams that advantage, I think is criminal.
Yeah, and I think that if you are going to do neutral site games and make them work and make them exciting, you have to do them the right way. Like Texas versus Oklahoma, the Red River rivalry, that one's great because it's such a unique environment. Same thing for Georgia versus Florida. But for Texas A&M and Arkansas, like that's a neutral site game that they play every single year at Jerry's World. And while it's a great game usually, and I mean, people usually tune into it, and in the past it was at 3:30 on CBS, it's not exactly this unique environment. Like you would much rather that be played at Kyle Field or at Arkansas Stadium and just do the home and home flip-flop it every year. So I agree with you. I think home games in general and provide better atmospheres than they do on the road, unless it's like these unique atmospheres that you provide because there's so much history behind them.
Yeah, and again, I'll get on the Kirby Smart train here. Recruiting opens up so much more. If this game was played in Athens or if this game was played in Death Valley, Dabo can have players out and Kirby Smart can have players out, and all of a sudden this game gets so much more magnified. Whereas if it's in Atlanta, it's kind of like, all right, this is a cool venue. But do you think there's ever a chance Clemson and Georgia play as conference opponents?
I don't know. That's a good question. There probably is a world. I think it's very likely that within the next 5 years, Clemson could be in the SEC or it's part of this two-team mega conference. So I think, would you like them to be like? Because again, it's hard to know because there'd be so many changes for Clemson to be in the conference that it's hard to know how you would do the scheduling. But would you rather that be one of the consistent games every single year, or consistent opponents for Georgia every single year? Like they play Clemson every single year. That's one of their like 2 or 3 opponents that they get every single year compared to other SEC opponents.
I wouldn't mind it. I think it would make dominating the SEC much harder. I mean, the SEC has already gotten much harder to win now with just the changes that you've seen in no more divisions. You've got 2 more added teams that are, let's be honest, national brands and somewhat of powerhouses. So I think dominating the SEC is something that we saw Alabama do for 10 years. We saw Georgia do it with the East for 5 or 6. I think those days are kind of over.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But I think it'd be cool, like, if you did do 3 consistent opponents, like for Georgia, if it was Florida, Auburn, and Clemson, that'd be some fun matchups every single year, especially if you got to do them like flip-flop them again, home and home every single year. I guess that would require Florida and Georgia to alter where they play their rivalry, but I think it would provide a lot of great matchups. I think it would be fun to reignite that old rivalry between Georgia and Clemson.
Yeah, but going back to this, how hard it is to dominate the SEC now, I think that the lack of divisions now is going to be the first thing, because you don't have to be better than 6 SEC teams. You have to be better than 7. You have to be better than all 14. And it's essentially 2 losses and you're out. Whereas you had 2 losses in 2014, you can still win the division just because, hey, maybe Florida stinks, maybe South Carolina trips up here. If you're Alabama, winning the West wasn't that bad because, hey, we just have to beat Auburn and LSU, and essentially we win the West every single time. That's not the case anymore. And on top of that, you added in Texas, a team that is now competing for national titles. Sark has got that program to where many fans thought it should have been for the last 15 years. And Oklahoma, while they're not where they were under Lincoln Riley, they're on the rise as well. So I think you're going to be looking at a very, very interesting era of college football where it's not always going to be, hey, Georgia and who do they play in? Georgia and Alabama playing in the SEC championship, or Georgia and whoever's representing the West. I think you're going to see a very, very different era of college football where the divisions, with the lack of divisions, you're going to have a mix-up more often than not.
I mean, if you look at it from Georgia's perspective, you essentially traded out Vanderbilt and South Carolina this season for Texas and Alabama.
Yeah, which... Well, I mean,
that's pretty significant.
Mississippi State, like, there's your gimme. Even there's always gonna have like one gimme week.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just saying, like, for these next 2 years, like, you're guaranteed to play both of those teams, and you're not going to play South Carolina or Vanderbilt like you used to every single year. And South Carolina and Vanderbilt were both the teams in the East where, at least for the last 5 or so years, you felt very confident going into those games, and you really didn't sweat those too much. Whereas now, you're going to have to play Texas, Ole Miss, and Alabama 2 years in a row. Now, next year, you get all 3 of those at home, so that's going to be fun. That's a big difference between what you have to do this year. But if you look at it through the focus of 2024, there's a big change in Georgia's schedule. So yeah, it's definitely a lot harder that you're not just now handling with the East, and you're handling with everybody in the SEC, and you don't just have to beat out five other teams. You have to beat out the entire 14 teams in the conference, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be... We kind of grew up in this era where the good team always won the conference. The good team always won their division. I think you're going to see mix-ups this year. Like, you're not going to see Alabama go to the West, win the West, or go to the SEC championship for 5 years in a row. Yeah. You're not going to see Georgia do that anymore. You're going to see a lot of twisting and turning. It might be Texas one year, it might be Georgia. Hell, you might get a Tennessee and Ole Miss and an Alabama. Like, things such as that, where I think it's going to be kind of this more spread out, less inclusive, or more exclusive, to the point where it's not just, hey, 1A versus 1B in the SEC championship. My other question to that brings is that, given all this, there's no divisions anymore. Is Texas now the biggest threat to Georgia succeeding in winning the SEC and dominating for national titles?
So I was thinking about this today, of whether or not Texas would be my answer to this question. And surprisingly, I'm kind of leaning towards no. I'm going to say that they aren't the biggest threat to Georgia, because when I was thinking about teams that have given Georgia trouble in the past, it's been these high-powered offenses that have elite wideouts and can really spread you out, and they just dominate in the passing game. Where Texas, they have a great quarterback. They have some questions in their wide receiver room. They do not have these wide receiver rooms that Alabama had in years past that dominated Georgia and led them to losing, and also had Nick Saban, the greatest coach of all time. But like, when Ohio State gave Georgia a run for their money, they had Marvin Harrison Jr., a great wideout. I mean, they had these elite pass catchers, and that's kind of what has always given Georgia trouble in these times, where they either came really, really close to losing a football game, or they ended up actually losing the ball game. And again, Texas has a great quarterback, and that makes up for a lot. But they don't have, like, a year ago when you had Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell, absolutely, I think Texas is your biggest threat. But me, I kind of steer more towards like an Ole Miss, who has Antoine Wells, and they also have Trey Harris, 2 really good wideouts, and you have Jackson Dart, a great quarterback, and you have Lane Kiffin, an elite offensive-minded head coach. Not that Sark isn't that, but I think that from an offensive standpoint, where teams are able to get Georgia, and because Georgia has one of the best defenses in the SEC every single year. So I think that where teams can get them is going to be on the offensive side of the football, and it's teams that can go punch for punch with Georgia's offense, and I think that could potentially be Ole Miss this year. I still think Texas is without a doubt up there. They are one of the teams that are going to be the biggest threat to Georgia because they have the most filled out roster, and they're more complete on both sides of the football. But Ole Miss filled out a lot of holes in the on the defensive side of the football this year in the transfer portal, and we don't exactly know what that's going to look like this year. If Lane Kiffin can't get things straightened out this year with the roster that he has, and I don't know that it's ever going to happen for Ole Miss's defense, but right now I kind of want to lean more towards Ole Miss and their offense being able to maybe be a bigger threat to Georgia than Texas's offense.
Yeah, I mean, Ole Miss definitely makes a great case. I think I was asking this question more of holistically, like throughout the future now that Nick Saban's gone, you know, who's the biggest threat to Georgia?
I definitely bet on Texas being more consistently good than any other program right now.
I agree, but I agree with everything you're saying about how this year it might not be the answer. Sark is an offensive genius. We've already established that. Queen Ewers is a very good quarterback, but I don't know if that wide receiver talent is adequate enough to kind of give Georgia's defensive backfield fits. So I'll agree with you that, it's probably Ole Miss this year, but the long-term outlook, the question I was asking while I was doing this is, why isn't it Alabama? Obviously, we know why it's not, because Nick Saban's not there, but why can't it be Alabama? Because Kalen DeBoer assembled a roster in Washington with a quarterback that had pinpoint accuracy. He made very good decisions. And by the way, they had 2 wide receivers that torched teams all year, which was kind of what that tailor-made offense was to beat a Kirby Smart defense. We've seen it year in and year out. Obviously, Ohio State gave them problems. Alabama gave Georgia fits all throughout 2020, 2021. Every team that's given Georgia problems or beaten them, it seems in the last 5 years, has had elite wide receiver play, pinpoint accuracy at the quarterback position, who can make good decisions, whether it be Mac Jones or Tua or even Bryce Young. So guys like that, I think it's kind of, why can't that be Bama with Kalen DeBoer? Now, I don't know if, like you said, this year it's going to be the answer, because Jalen Miller, I don't think, is this. But Kalen DeBoer is definitely going to recruit well, or he's going to recruit better than he did at Washington, at least.
Yeah, I think the reason why you can't say it right now is because you just simply don't know. I mean, it's a big change from going from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer. So I think that's the reason why you can't really say that right now, that Alabama is going to be the biggest threat. But I mean, this year, if Ryan Williams is as good as advertised and Jalen Milroe takes major steps forward, and you see development from Kalen DeBoer and he continues to recruit at the level that Alabama has in the past, or even at a top 5, top 7 level, then Alabama's going to hang around. They're going to be one of the best teams of the SEC every single year. But I just think that from right now, the comfort that you have of saying Sark and what he's built in Texas and what he already has on the roster, and knowing what he's able to do offensively, and knowing that he's kind of already groomed his team to this SEC style of play, then you feel comfortable saying that it's going to work out and they're going to continue success. Where, Kalen DeBoer did not know that he was going to be coming to the SEC this year, whereas Steve Sarkisian did know he was coming to the SEC this year. He's kind of been able to build up his roster and get prepared for this shift for a couple of years now, where Kalen DeBoer has not had the ability to do so. He's kind of been having to do things on the fly, while also having this looming shadow of Nick Saban right over his shoulder. Whether he wants to admit it or not, it's still there. The fan base still feels it, and he probably still feels it, and the players still feel it there. But they returned some key pieces this year between Jalen Milroe, and you get Caden Proctor back, and you have Justice Haynes as your running back, and Ryan Williams, like I mentioned, Kobe Prentice as well. It's just a matter of me, defensively as well, losing Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terry and Arnold. Those are some big pieces to miss, and that was one of the bigger reasons that gave Georgia fits last year, is because they had a really good secondary. They were able to box up Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, whether they were healthy or not. They still did their due diligence there, and they held that Georgia offense. So if he can keep both of those things going, I think that's something that we really don't talk about enough either, is that you did lose T-Rob, you lose Tavares Robinson to Georgia, so that's another defensive shift for you, and you lose Caleb Williams, who was supposed to be the star of your defense over the next few years. So a lot of moving pieces while also having a little bit of consistency, but there's just too much uncertainty and a lot more questions for me to say it will be Alabama moving forward still.
Yeah, the reason I lean Sark is because, like you said, Texas has been Sark's team for a while. Bama has just been thrown into the lap of Kalen DeBoer, and he's still I don't want to say scrambling, because that makes it seem like he's freaking out and he's unorganized, but he has been trying to get those roster pieces together, get your own recruits in the door, kind of pick up where Nick Saban left off on the recruiting trail, get your toes wet in the South, because recruiting in the Southeast is much different than it is in the West Coast. Let's just be honest there. And also get accustomed to Southern culture, Southeastern. Now, I know Texas wasn't in the SEC, they were in the Big 12, but they still have a much more there's more in touch with what goes on down south than what a Washington would be. So that's why I lean Sark as well.
Yeah, he'll have to adjust to things on the fly, and he's going to get baptized by fire a good bit this year, because you do host Georgia at home, and that's going to be a big turning point. Or I shouldn't say turning point, but it's going to be a good indicating factor of year one. But we're like good college football, like the good college football fans that we are, we're going to give him time, and we're going to allow him to figure things out and get adjusted to being in Tuscaloosa. So I think that he could absolutely turn that program into that, because the dude's done nothing but win everywhere he's gone. And I don't see any reason why that would stop, because he goes to Alabama and he moves across the country, and it's not Washington and it's not the Pac-12 anymore, it's the SEC. He's a good football coach, and that's why Alabama hired him. And I do have some trust in him to be able to figure things out at Alabama, get the recruiting going, and get his personnel in there. And he's already done that by bringing Austin Mack from Washington. He brought in Will Rogers. While that may not really fit in it, He recruited Will Rogers to Washington. Like, I think he's able to figure things out, and he gets people that fit his systems. It's just a matter of you got to build it and build it and build it and take steps forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, so we're at the point now where team's last season's over. It's been in the books for a while. You've kind of accounted for everything. You look at players who had good freshman years and things such that. You look at players that came in kind of wide-eyed, might need to have a better sophomore year. Who do you think on this Georgia roster is a player that needs to have a sophomore surge?
For me, it starts with Roderick Robinson. And I think we all expect Roderick Robinson to have a fantastic sophomore season because of what we saw as a freshman. He flashed. He looked fantastic. He's a SOB to tackle in the open field. He's a tough guy to bring down. And so if he can build upon that, and I think we all expect him to, he's going to be a pivotal piece to this Georgia running back room. But that's exactly why he needs a sophomore surge, and he needs a big second year because Branson Robinson is coming back. He's expected to return this year, and he's expected to get into the rotation at some point this year. But we don't know when that's going to be exactly. We still don't have an exact timetable of when Branson's coming back. And 2, we don't know what he's going to look like coming back from injury and how long it's going to take for him to adjust getting back into the football field and getting back to contact tackling on Saturdays, So Roderick Robinson needs to be a big piece for this running back room, because if he isn't, then you're kind of just stuck with, you're either going to put in Cash Jones to buy Branson Robinson some time and things like that. So him having a great season is pivotal for Georgia in the run game, because if you can tag team him and Trevor Etienne in the backfield this year, it's going to be one of the best duos in the FCC. Yeah,
I think you have your feature back in Etienne. Having Rob as that knockout punch, as a kind of change of pace and just a bruiser, I think it's going to be really, really big for him to be, if he can live up to that kind of progress. So I think that's a really good one. I had Lawson Lucky.
Ooh.
I think Lawson Lucky is a guy that showed a lot of promise last year, might have lived in the shadow of Brock Bowers and Oscar Delp, got some run when Brock Bowers was hurt, but it's clear that the Georgia offensive staff didn't have full trust in him just yet. Mm-hmm. I think this is a year where you have to really, really earn some of that trust. He's probably going to be tight end 3 this year as well. You have to imagine with Ben Urasic coming in and Oscar Delp still there. But I think that he's a guy who could make a couple of flash plays every few games. Like, oh my God, Lawson Lucky's here. I'm so glad we have him coming into 2025.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a star or have like this amazing, incredible sophomore season that we've seen from some guys where it's like, holy shit, this guy came out of nowhere, like Dylan Bell-esque. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's what you're going to see with him, but I do think you have to kind of prove to coaching staff and get on the radar of, hey, this is tight end 1 next year, and he's extremely talented.
Yeah, that's a really good pick for Lawson Lucky. Obviously, the attention is really focused on Oscar Delp right now and is focused on Ben Urasic. Those are going to be your main 2 guys. But Lawson Lucky was a guy that flashed all of last spring, and there's a lot of good buzz around his name as a freshman. And then last year, obviously, you're not going to see a whole lot of him because you have Brock Bowers and you have Oscar Delp, whereas this year, you still have 2 guys ahead of him, but you have more trust in him. He's got a whole year in the system already, and he probably feels a lot more comfortable, and the game's not moving as fast as it was last year. Right. I think that was something that he had to deal with a little bit of. You could tell the game was just moving a lot faster for him, or too fast for him to really process things and be the player that he is. So I think that's a fantastic pick. Defensively, for me, on the other side of the football, I would go Jordan Hall. Kristen Miller is a redshirt freshman. That's why I didn't include him in this conversation. Otherwise, I would put him into this list. But Jordan Hall, for me, as a true freshman, he showed flashes as a freshman last year. But coming in as a sophomore, it's very pivotal, not only for him to be good this year, because you need some defensive line depth, and you need that defensive line to flash and be better than it was last year, but because you need some certainty that moving forward, once Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson are out of there, that you're going to have guys to fill the void. You're going to have guys to be able to step up and carry the torch for these guys next year in 2025. So I think it's a big year for Jordan Hall. I expect big things out of him, and I think, he's not going to be an every down player, but in those 25 snaps or so that he's in every single game, or 15 snaps that he's in, I think he needs to flash, he needs to play well, and he needs to show signs of being a really serviceable player for Georgia moving forward.
I agree with that. I didn't do a defensive position.
Oh, you went offense.
Yeah, I did a second offensive guy. I think Anthony Evans is a guy who really is going to benefit from a sophomore surge this year. Now, again, not because that, like, hey, this is your last chance to kind of prove something, but because you're going to have such a mass exodus at the wide receiver group after 2024. Like, you have to assume that Dylan Bell, Rara Thomas, Dominic Lovett, Colby Young are all guys that if the season goes as we expect it to, are going to enter the NFL draft. So it's really going to leave you as kind of the old vet in that room. So if you, in order for him to make a name for himself, to earn trust of coaches, and to not only that, gain confidence in yourself, I think he has to really have a nice sophomore season.
Yeah, everybody's expecting Anthony Evans to have a big year, especially knowing what he built, how he ended last season, and the momentum he built up coming into this year, and he looked good during G-Day as well. So people are definitely expecting a big sophomore year from him. I have two more. They're both on the defensive side of the football.
Bring it on.
Daniel Harris. He's a sophomore this year. This is a defensive back that people are expecting big things out of between him, Julian Humphrey, and Dalen Everett. And the way for him to have a big season, honestly, or this massive season that people are kind of expecting, is I think if Dalen Everett does end up moving to star and you do get Julian Humphrey and Daniel Harris playing side by side, I mean, that's creating a massive window of opportunity. But Daniel Harris is just built to play defensive back in the SEC. I mean, he is built to be one of the better players. He's fast, he's quick, he's got the length, he's got the frame, he's got the size, all of that good stuff already. And he showed great tape last year, and he showed great consistency last year. Keep on building off of it. Play great this season. You get him for a whole nother year. I think you could be seeing back-to-back seasons of Daniel Harris being your starting defensive back, and you need to see it this year because he came back for a reason. You wanted him to stay for a reason. We need to see that on the football field, and I think you will. And then my second one, which Chat has already hit on actually, and this is one that's hard to ignore, but Damon Wilson. Last year, I think Brooks was really high on him last year. I know as a freshman, he thought he was going to have a big sack season, but Damon Wilson coming into year 2 now, another guy that he got some reps last year. He's going to get more comfortable, and he's going to be able to be this guy for Georgia, I think, coming off the edge where he can just go out there and make plays. He can wreak havoc. And for a guy that have a sophomore surge too, while he may not be like a mainstay on the defensive side of the football, like consistently, when he is on the football field, if he does flash, that would create this sophomore surge and a lot of hype to build around him. And I think that there's going to be a lot of attention elsewhere on Georgia's defense between guys like CJ Allen, Mykel Williams, Warren Brinson, Nazir Stackhouse, TID, like those types of guys, to where Damon Wilson has a big opportunity for him to have a big sophomore season.
Damon Wilson strikes me as a guy who could probably be the biggest havoc wreaker on this defense this year, just because his ability to come in on third down and rush the passer, I think, is going to be something that, if he lives up to the hype and lives up to the expectations that so many people have for him, is going to be something that you haven't really seen at the Georgia football program under Kirby Smart in a while, where you have a game breaker in the passing game. So Damon Wilson's definitely something who's going to benefit the most from it. Moving on, though, who's a player that you think will pop in 2024? Not necessarily can be any age, but someone that you think is kind of under the radar or just on the cusp of being nationally known. Like, for example, I think the perfect example of this is Dylan Bell last year. Dylan Bell came in 2022 and was a solid player, was a solid X wide receiver. Obviously, with all the things that happened in the running back room in 2023, he got some run there. He was utilized a lot in the passing game. He kind of really shined towards the end of that season, became a national household name. So who's the player that you think has the opportunity to do that this year?
So I think to be one of these pop players, like when you mentioned Dylan Bell, I think that in order for you to be one of these guys is you aren't exactly on the field a whole lot, but when you are, you make big time plays and people notice you just that much. Like you give a small enough sample size to where there's only good things to go off of. Like one name that comes to mind when I think of players that pop in a season is Channing Tindall in 2020. I can very vividly remember Georgia fans falling in love with him when Georgia played Tennessee at home. And it was like, who is this dude just running with his hair on fire, making plays in the backfield? It was Channing Tindall. And you got him in spurts and you got a small enough sample size on him where there's only good things to go off of. So there's two players that I think this could happen to this next year. For me, this is where Lawson Lucky comes into play. Because you have Ben Urosic and you have Oscar Delp, you're going to get a small enough sample size and you're going to get a good viewpoint of Lawson Lucky as a sophomore this year, to where coming out of this season, when all the attention goes on him, there's going to be so much great buzz around Lawson Lucky in the tight end room, and he's going to be the headliner of that group, and he's going to make people really excited for what he's going to do in year 3. And then for my second player, Sokovie White. This is one of these players that the way I envision Sokovie White being one of these pop players is, if Georgia's up big in a game late, you're going to get Sokovie White and he's going to break one for an explosive play. Or if he gets put in at special teams, you're going to see some fire and explosiveness from him, because that's what he does. I mean, he makes big plays. He's an explosive playmaker. We saw that at G-Day. took one to the house for a touchdown. So that's how I think Sakovi White becomes one of these players. And I think he might end up being the player that Georgia fans just fall in love with over next season. That's who everybody's really talking about. I mean, people are already really excited to see what he does.
I like that one. So the first guy I have who I think could pop in 2024, and this might rub a certain amount of Georgia fans the wrong way, I think Dalen Everett can make a huge name for himself and become a household name. Because we're coming into a year of Georgia defense where there's always seemingly been one guy at corner. You went from Tyson Campbell to Keely Ringo to Kamari Lassiter. There's always been the one guy. There isn't really a one guy this year. And I think Dalen Everett has the opportunity to really step into that role. And obviously, Georgia coaches see something in him. There's a reason why they keep putting him on the field, despite what you believe, despite you think that he sucks. I don't think he's a bad player at all. I think he's actually a very, very good defensive back, and he could make a couple of big flash plays for Georgia this year and garner that national attention. The guy I have on the offensive side of the ball, and you kind of hinted at this for sophomore surges, I think Roderick Robinson is going to be a very, very dangerous change of pace for defenses.
He's literally going to make people pop.
Yeah, literally going to pop and quite literally run people over. So... And plus, I think the fact that you have ETN on your backfield now, it automatically draws more attention to your running back room. The national narrative is probably going to turn into, hey, is Georgia's running back room kind of back to maybe having a 1,000-yard rusher? When you have that happen, and then on a 3rd and 1, Roderick Robinson runs through a linebacker's face, that's going to be a big sophomore pop for him. And I think he's going to be a guy who really makes a name for himself in 2024 and gains that national attention heading into 2025.
The thing about the thing that I love so much about Georgia's running back room right now, and thinking of Etienne and Robinson being the 1-2 punch for them, is that it's such a great change of pace, and it's a big enough change of pace where it is going to give defenses fits, because they're two different run styles and they're two different players. So you have Etienne, the explosive guy, the one that could be a game breaker for you, and then you have a guy like Roderick Robinson who, I mean, it's going to be like you just did 2 downs of Trevor Etienne where you're chasing him down, you're trying to beat him to the boundary, and you're gas as a linebacker, and then they sub in Roderick Robinson, you're like, holy crap.
Shit.
You mean I got to tackle this guy now on 3rd and short, and he's just going to be barreling straight at my face? I think it's such a great change of pace for Georgia, and I think it's what's going to make it so effective. And then you get Branson Robinson back, who really felt like a little bit of both of Etienne and Robinson in the same body. So I think it's built for a lot of success for Georgia to be very successful in the run game.
Yeah. So a couple of those guys that we mentioned, it's likely that this is their last year at Georgia if things go well for them. If you could pick one player in the 2020 for heading into the 2025 season that you were guaranteed would be on the roster, who'd you be? And I'm going to go ahead and say Carson Beck is off the table.
I was about to say, it's like the obvious answer is Carson Beck.
The quarterback position, obviously, you want to have a great quarterback for as long as you can, and Carson Beck's probably the most proven commodity. So outside of Carson Beck, who would you like to see, or who would you like to have guaranteed return for one more year at Georgia? And by the way, there's no recruiting repercussions. There's no transfer portal repercussions. I know that kind of plays into it. Oh, if this player comes back, this player's going to leave, and then we won't have them for the next 2 years. Don't worry about it. This is just for, hypothetically, if you could pick one player to be on the 2025 roster from this year's roster, who would it be?
Malachi Starks would be my first pick.
That's a great pick.
Think that, I mean, he's head and shoulders above everybody else in the SEC as a safety. He's one of the best defensive players in all of college football. And he would be a great returning piece, not only because of who Malachi Starks is, but you're telling me that I get a 4th year of Malachi Starks and I get year 2 of KJ Bolden in the secondary?
Ooh, that's scary.
That's a nasty duo, and I like the looks of that, and we're going to get to see that a little bit this year, I'm sure. So especially if we get a good glimpse of that and it's as good as advertised as I think it's going to be, I would love to see a 4th year Malachi Starks and a KJ Bolden. Another one, I'm trying to think of a sec. Here, you go ahead. Or actually, I take that back. Dylan Bell would be one that I would like to see reassured.
Yes,
he comes back for a second one, because it would just build up some consistency for the wide receiver room, because there's good and bad things with how Georgia's wide receiver room is built right now, because the good thing is that you have a large pool of talent that you can go from, and Mike Bobo has a lot of weapons to work with, and he has a variety of weapons to work with, but there's also a world where you lose a good chunk of your wide receiver room this season, and then you're back at the drawing board all the production that we just built in the transfer portal this last year and built in the development from the recruiting trail all the way into this year, we just lost to the NFL, so now we got to do it again. So if he could get Dylan Bell back again, that would create some consistency and some reassurance in the wide receiver room of this isn't just going to be a one-hit wonder type year for James Coley in that room. We have multiple years that we can stack up and really make this thing into something that is appealing to recruits.
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. And by the way, senior Dylan Bell going in with that wide receiver room, that you have to imagine is going to thin out a little bit after 2023. I mean, that's a star in the making if you have that. So I completely agree with that. I chose Michael Williams just because I think that anchor that you have on the defensive side, wherever he plays, is going to be so big and so impactful. And by the way, him playing at the jack position this year, he might become one of the better pass rushers in college football. So if you can guarantee that, I know that sacks has always been something that Georgia fans are kind of like, oh, why don't we have a lot of these? If you have Michael Williams in 2025, I think your sack numbers are going to be through the roof.
Yeah, I mean, it's so rare that you get a defensive lineman like Michael Williams, especially a guy coming off of the edge that can impact the game of football as a true freshman and continue to get better every single year and continue to develop. And if he, especially knowing too that he's moving to jack this year, if you could get 2 years of Michael Williams playing jack, that'd be such a big difference maker for Georgia.
So the second player I picked is Chaz Chambliss.
Oh.
Now I picked this more to kind of just rile fans up because I think it would be so funny to watch Chaz Chambliss come in 2025 and be one of the most safest players, safe as in you never have to worry about is he going to do the wrong thing. He's always in the right spot. He always makes the right play. And just watch fans go ballistic. Oh, my God. We have to watch another year of Chaz Chambliss get ran outside. We can't set the edge. He's terrible. It would be so fun for me to watch.
Devious.
And then the third one for me is also kind of devious. It's also kind of selfish. But I would love for Brett Thorson to just play football at Georgia forever. I know you only see him like 10 times a season just because Georgia doesn't punt that often, but when he's there, he does a great job. Obviously, you go back to that 2022 punt he had against Tennessee, but his personality is also so huge and so infectious on the Georgia program. So he's one of those guys where it's like, oh man, I love him not only because he's a great player, but because he's a great personality.
I can only help but laugh whenever Brett Thorson is brought up on the show now, because the only thing that comes to mind is Brooks doing his Australian impersonation every time. And
it's not a bad Australian.
It's not a bad one. It's so funny to think about because I don't know why. Because the funny thing to me about it is like he did it so well the first time, and then he kept trying after that, and he couldn't get it down, and he lost it for a little bit. And so then I think about like he's definitely in the basement just practicing his Australian accent so he could break it out again. This would have been a prime window for Brooks to try it out, but he's not here with us tonight, so I just was giggling in my mind thinking about that. But Brett Thorson, a good one. Plus, special teams matter. That's what we believe on this show.
They definitely matter. Brooks isn't here, so we can say it. Special teams do matter.
One of the most important sides of the game of football.
And he's kind of changed his tune on it. I think he's learned to accept that he's wrong there, but special teams definitely matter, and having Brett Thorson on your team for another year, for however as long as you can have him, I think would be insane.
Brooks did say he has 2 more years of eligibility, I believe.
He does, but I mean, you also have to assume that
he'd actually want to go kick. He'd actually want to go
he
punt
want to
in the
go
NFL.
kick, and oh, by the way, you're a draft pick if you go out this year.
Sure.
Like, you're probably the first punter taken off the board now. That means you're not off till, at best, the 4th round, but that was
crazy that people are taking punters that early now.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like best case scenario.
Look, I'm a believer of special teams matter and punters are important, but 4th round draft pick important. I think I might disagree with that a little bit.
All right, so for the last 2 segments, do you want to go to talk about Thomas Blackshear, or do you want to do Mount Rushmore of hate for Georgia fans?
Oh, we also have I also have or here I'll throw in another one. Is there an argument this is Georgia's best preseason shot at a Natty ever?
Preseason, yes.
Okay, so we're going with this segment. I like this.
Sorry, I was answering the question. My bad.
No, you can answer. We can answer it real quick.
Preseason, I think yes, just because hey, Nick Saban's not there anymore. Hey, we've got a returning quarterback who's a Heisman contender. Hey, we've got all this defensive talent. Hey, it seems like we have the best wide receiver room we've had under Kirby Smart. Hey, we got an NFL guy in the running back room. I think all of those point and indicate it to yes, and then you have to realize that you also have to go to Texas. You also have to travel to Alabama. You also have to travel to Ole Miss. You also have to win more games to win the national title this year. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that's I don't think that's really set into fans' minds where, like, you have to win an additional, 2 games if you want to be national champions? Like, that's so hard to do. I mean, going 15-0 is hard enough. Going 13-0 is hard enough. Going 12-0 is hard enough. Going 16, maybe 17-0, I don't see how that's... It's not impossible, but it's so much harder to do. So I think that on paper, yes, this is one of Georgia's best chances. But I think once you start getting to the nitty-gritty of the season, you're going to realize this is a lot more difficult than people thought.
Yeah, schedule-wise is definitely harder, but I think when you just look at the outlook of the roster, it probably does stack up a little bit better and a little bit more fulfilled than it does the other 2 years that you won the national title, especially after the 2021 national title, because you lost 15 draft picks in the NFL.
Yep.
You lost a lot of meaningful contributors on both sides of the football, so there are questions there. And the fact that Kirby Smart overcame that was such a big deal to that program and to college football to witness that and watch it happen. I just think that you get so many crucial pieces returning this year, and you use the transfer portals and you utilize it in a very important manner to where you filled out holes in your wide receiver room, and you went and got a Xavier McLeod on the defensive line where you needed some help there, and you went and got Ben Urosic to pair up Oscar Dope, and you went and got Trevor Etienne. Like, you filled out, you added depth in a lot of important places, and I think the roster is filled out more completely than it has in previous years, to where I think that you can make the argument where Georgia is set up roster wise to be favored as a national title than compared to other years.
Roster wise, for sure, I agree with you. Like, the returning talent you've had, combined with the fact that you went and got some really, really good guys in the transfer portal, combined with the fact that the guys you went and got in the transfer portal last year seem to be making huge strides. So roster wise, absolutely. I just think the circumstances and the outside scheduling doesn't really make this not unfavorable, but it's not like, hey, Georgia's a shoo-in for the Natty this year.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, let's get into this Georgia's Mount Rushmore for most hated. I think this is a fun segment specifically for the Georgia Hour. We did do this in the NBR Hour, so if you want to hear who we think are the most hated people in all of college football in the history, go back to the NBR Hour and catch that one. But we're just going to do this one from a Georgia fan perspective, from a Georgia lens, those rose-colored glasses that everybody likes to claim we use all the time. That's how we're doing this one. So from a Georgia fan's perspective, who do you think would be on the Mount Rushmore of most hated?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
All right, so the first one I'm going Nick Fairley.
That's such a good pull.
What Nick Fairley did to Aaron Murray in 2010 was one of the dirtiest play, like one of the most egregious play. How do I word this? One of the absolute most egregious displays of bad sportsmanship I've ever seen in my life. And I was like 9 years old. I remember being so upset at Nick Fairley for stepping on Aaron Murray and driving him into the ground. Aaron Murray's gone on air before in the mid. Like, he almost quit football because of this, because the way that it was. Nick Fairley will forever be etched in Georgia fans' mind as someone who was hated.
And the thing, too, is, like, despite that being 10 years ago or whatever, it's replayed every single time Georgia and Auburn face off. Like, in the stadium at Jordan-Hare, if you go to that game as a Georgia fan, they play those highlights on the big board every single year. It gets tossed around on Twitter. You're reminded of it every single year. So it just refuels the hatred every time. But that is a tremendous pull. Nick Fairley is a good one.
You want me to keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
All right, so for the next one, I have Brian Allen. Now, if you don't know who Brian Allen is the guy who reported Todd Gurley for his jersey sales and what got him suspended in the 2014 season, which of course led to him coming back against the Auburn game and tearing his ACL. Now, there's a wide argument out there that if Brian Allen doesn't exist, Todd Gurley might win the Heisman in 2014. He probably doesn't tear his ACL. Probably still might have a chance at being in the NFL, winning MVP, still being so. You could make a very good argument that the downfall of Todd Gurley has been led back to Brian Allen. So he definitely deserves the hate from Georgia fans that he has. My next ones is I had trouble picking, so I'll just go ahead and get this one there because I think it's a viable answer. Steve Spurrier. Steve Spurrier in the 90s destroyed Georgia football. I mean, I have horror stories from my dad talking about how you would go to the Georgia-Florida game just to watch him lose 45-14. He'd be running up the score. Everyone hated him. And then, oh, by the way, he came to the SEC East and was a thorn in your side for a good...
Chirping you in the post-game press conferences and the pre-game press conferences, all that stuff.
Yep, so Steve Spurrier I definitely think is on the Mount Rushmore of hate, although I don't necessarily, in my personal opinion, hate Steve Spurrier.
I think he's been detached from the game long enough to where now Georgia fans probably find some joy in Steve Spurrier because he's more so crapping on his own former team, Florida, than he is anybody else. Yeah. So I think he's been detached long enough, but when he was a coach in the conference, absolutely,
hated.
He was absolutely
very hated. The last one I have is any opposing player who takes Hedges from Sanford Stadium after beating him. The last instance of this was 2019 when South Carolina beat Georgia in overtime. It was double overtime, I believe. And the tradition is, for whatever reason, if you beat Georgia or you upset them at home, you go and you rip some of the hedges and you take it with them. That lights a fire under Georgia fans' ass like I've never seen. Like, you are hated for that.
They were coveted.
And the ironic thing about it is, like, we did the same thing at graduation.
Dude, yeah.
Like, everyone was taking pieces of the hedges and no one was banging on it. It's fine. But if you're an opposing player and you beat Georgia, don't you go near those damn hedges.
I was so shocked that they didn't have things covering the hedges or anything.
Nah, bro.
Since they're the new hedges, I was so shocked there wasn't more strict security around those because, again, those are very sacred. So
So those are my 4 from Mount Rushmore. For honorable mentions, I have Nick Saban, just because, obviously you know why. And then Tua, once again, you can argue no Nick Saban, no Tua. You've got way more Natties than you do this right now. So those are my honorable mentions, but I don't think you can necessarily hate those guys.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. I did have Steve Spurrier, but I'm going to replace him, and I'm actually going to use a good suggestion from the chat from our boy Lee Wiley. Brandon Spikes, I think that's a good one to put on the Mount Rushmore. I think that, again, that's an easy one to hate.
What he did to Washaun Neely should put him in jail.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's just, again, an easy one for Georgia fans to hate, and I think that's one that every time you hear that name, you just get a bad taste in your mouth, So I'll replace Steve Spurrier with Brandon Spikes, and I'll keep it over on that same side and go with Tim Tebow. I think as we've gotten further and further away from Tim Tebow's days as a Florida Gator, people have grown to like Tim Tebow because it's very hard not to respect what he does. He does both as both a college football analyst and as a human being, and as his foundations and whatnot. Like, he's just a good person, and he's easy to respect. But man, during his run with Florida, during those 4 years, Tim Tebow is absolutely hated by Georgia, mostly because it was such a large mountain to climb over to beat them and to finally get topple over them. And they ran the SEC East during those years in the SEC. So he was definitely one of the most hated players, in my opinion, in Georgia history. So I had to put him on here. Jordan-Hare Stadium belongs on the Mount Rushmore because there's both bad memories there, and there's, for whatever reason, there's some bad voodoo magic over there. Me and you got to experience that firsthand this year when we went and covered the game, and it was a nail-biter the whole way through.
There's a weird aura about that stadium. It is, never traveled for a Georgia game there. I urge you to go because it is very weird.
It is very susceptible. It's like, what the heck is going on here? And I thought for sure that I was about to witness some Auburn voodoo magic in my first year going to that stadium. So that was I think that one definitely belongs on the list, and also the prayer or Jordan-Hare, like, that also belongs on the list as well. Like, there's just bad memories.
You put plays on there.
Well, like, it's just like Jordan-Hare also has bad memories. That's why that's why it belongs on Mount Rushmore. That's why it's hated. And then for my last one, I necessarily don't understand this one, but after watching this unfold over the last 2 years and watching how much distaste Georgia fans have for this player and how much trolling they did his way, Jermaine Burton, I feel like, deserves a spot on the Mount Rushmore for most hated, because I have never seen a fan base revolt against a player so quickly once he hit the portal and went to Alabama. Now, I know he did some things that makes him very easy to dislike, after the Tennessee game, but every single time Jermaine Burton had a bad game, Georgia fans were making graphics. They were making tweets, like, trolling him, like, ha, 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 Ladd McConkey's better than you. Ladd McConkey pushed you out. For the last 2 years, Georgia fans had nothing but bad things to say about Jermaine Burton.
It was hilarious that there was a very short time period from after they won the first Natty where it was, oh my God, we just lost Jermaine Burton because Stetson Bennett's coming back, to like almost instantaneous. It was like, fuck Jermaine Burton. Everyone hated him. So I agree with that. Jermaine Burton is one of the more hated players. I don't understand the hate necessarily at first.
I was just kind of like, who cares, man?
He's definitely grown into it, and obviously what he did after trolling the players, trolling the fans, that fuels it even more. Leaving any player who leaves Georgia, there's kind of a disdain for, like,
for the most part.
Justin Fields always has kind of this aura around him now, where certain players, certain fans, not players, but certain fans aren't a fan of him. So Jermaine Burton is definitely a great answer for that. Is there any other player that kind of transferred away and people are like soured on so quickly?
Barry Alexander.
Yeah.
Just because of what the comments that were made about why he left Georgia and things like that. Like, that one soured very quickly. But I'd say really him and Jermaine are really the only two that you can think of like, as soon as they transferred, it was very quickly. Like, Georgia fans just don't like them anymore. Brenton Cox, you transfer to Florida. Yeah. That's always going to create some problems and some dislike. And then I have one honorable mention. I'm not going to go into any discussion as to why, because Georgia fans are going to know why. I'll just say his name, Trigger Trey.
Trigger Trey. That username will always stick with me. If you know, you know. That's all. If you know, you know. By the way, Brooks just dropped some nugs on Patreon.
Some nuggies?
So head over to patreon.com/BrooksAustin if you want to get some exclusive recruiting details from what he's doing out on the trail. The reason why he's not here. So if you're not signed up for that, I recommend you do. It's actually very good stuff. I believe there is still a free 7-day trial as well. So if you'd like to come and just see what it's like, see the kind of info that rolls in, see the kind of nugs that we're talking about over on both Discord and on Patreon, that's the place to be. And it's a great community over there. We're both part of it.
Got some great dog fans over there, some constant discussion, things like this. You could get into a discussion of who's the most hated player by you in Georgia football history. And it's just it's a great community to be a part of. So you should join that today. Again, patreon.com/Brooks Austin.
Speaking of Brooks on the trail, he got a chance to talk to Georgia's newest commit today, Thomas Blackshear. He interviewed him, kind of just got his thoughts of, what made you choose Georgia ultimately? How was your recruitment? Things such as that. And we put an article out on it, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
So do you want to go ahead and go into what Thomas talked about?
Yeah, I think this was a good follow-up because yesterday, if you didn't know, that we went and looked at his sophomore film, and we walked away pretty impressed with it, but there's some questions about it, kind of like development, because it was sophomore tape, it wasn't junior tape, and just kind of knowing, we would like to know what the development is, and then also, again, what made a 4-star wide receiver like Thomas Blackshear ultimately decide to go to Georgia. And so Brooks, in his interview, we'll read you the quote right now. Blackshear said, "I chose Georgia because it's close to home. I love the culture. Every time I go up there, they show mad love. Coach Kirby, Coach Coley, and like before Coach Coley, Coach BMAC was a cool dude. Getting to know Coach Coley, he will push me hard and he will get me where I need to get." This is another quote that I think Georgia fans are really going to appreciate. He was kind of talking about his relationship with Coley, the recruitment there, and how things unfolded there. And he says, as soon as Coach Coley got to Georgia, he immediately texted me. And when I got down there, he told me I remind him of George Pickens a little bit. Ooh. That's got to be pretty enticing to hear as a Georgia fan. And then also, we had some questions about some speed. What's the speed look like on the field? It's kind of hard to tell from film. And again, that was 2 years ago now. Well, Brooks said in Discord today that he ran a 4.55. He has 4.55 speed in the 40, so he's plenty fast enough to play wide receiver in the SEC. So those are all good things to know. We thought that'd be a good follow-up from yesterday watching the film, continue to talk about that and just how impactful he could be.
There is one quote in there, I believe, that maybe not necessarily in the article, but that he said in the interview with Brooks that really stood out to me, and it kind of exemplified why Georgia probably took this guy. And it referred to how he felt about blocking. Do you have that in the article, or is that?
No, but I do know that he just said, Brooks asked him, what can Georgia fans expect when you get on a campus? And he said, you're going to get a team player. You're going to get a physical wide receiver. I love to block. I love running routes. And he basically said, I'm a playmaker. But yeah, I love to block.
I love to block stood out with me big time because that's essentially what Georgia looks for in wide receivers. Not like, hey, we only want blockers because we're not going to throw the ball. You look for guys who are willing to block and enjoy doing it because it's such a good culture fit. Because if you're a wide receiver, if you're a skill player and you love doing what is probably the most selfless act in football,
absolutely,
blocking, that's such a good fit for you culturally, which is why Georgia took him. Obviously, he's got an incredible skill set. He has potential to be the next George Pickens. I mean, if James Coley is comparing him to that, a guy who was on staff during that season where George Pickens was there that freshman year, most likely had a heavy hand to do in his recruitment of him at first. If James Coley is comparing this guy to George Pickens, there's some really, really exciting things going on there.
Wide receivers blocking in football is the equivalent to setting screens in basketball because it's something that's never going to be put in the stat sheet. Nope. It's really never something that gets put in the highlight reel unless you're George Pickens and you just throw somebody straight down on their face. But a lot of times it goes under the radar. You're not the one that's making the play. You're not the one stuffing the stat sheet on that play. You're not scoring the bucket. You're not picking up the yards. But you're doing your job that is required to make sure that that play works and to make sure that you free up space for your teammate. And that's something that does get you on the field at Georgia. And if you want to play as a freshman, if you can be a great blocker out in space as a wide receiver, that's a great way to do it. He is physical, so I can understand why he's good at blocking and why he has a willingness to do so. And he just seems like a physical body that is a straight playmaker. He's actually said in the interview that when he went to Georgia, was something that he saw of why he thinks he's going to be a great fit in Georgia's offense is because he saw a lot of screens, he saw a lot of go routes, and he saw a lot of posts. And when we watched his highlight film last night, it was a lot of screens of literally just saying, get Blackshear the ball and let him take it to the house. And that's what he did on a consistent basis. So some good things to hear from there.
Yeah, Coley's comparison to him at George Pickens makes me wonder if they kind of saw him as this X role.
Yeah.
Like when I was watching film, I thought to myself, I don't know if he's necessarily got the size to play that X. I think George Pickens is 6'3".
Yeah.
So like you have to be usually X's are a little bit taller, a little bit lengthier. He's listed at 6'1", probably measures in around 6 foot even. So I'm surprised that they're saying, implying that he's going to be an X if they're comparing him to George Pickens, but it'll be something interesting to look at. Should his recruitment or should his commitment stay true? Should he get on Georgia's campus at some point? Maybe perhaps this season for postseason spring or not spring, but bowl practices. So there's a chance we get a look at him this year.
Yeah. He according to 247, he's listed at 6'1", 197. So
okay.
George is 6'3". I just looked that up as well. So not quite as tall as George, but I mean, if you're physical like him, you have all the capability in the world to play X at Georgia. I mean, Georgia too, like they find ways to be creative with them. Like you're not necessarily just this, you don't necessarily have to be this big body X that can go up there and make plays over the head catches and things like that, so they can use him in a variety of ways, and they could plug him into different spots. And I think he could just be one of these flexible wide receivers that you could plug in at X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, that's kind of all I have for that.
Yeah, I think that kind of wraps up.
Do we know where Brooks is going tomorrow?
I have no idea. He's a busy man. He's got a chaotic schedule, and he shows up at a bunch of schools every single day.
Tears his calf.
Just puts in a bunch of work for this network, for the website, and for you guys as well. I mean, hopefully when we get him back into studio, whenever we can get him back on the show, he'll have a load of thoughts from the trail to dump on you guys for the show. So excited for that one. But again, yeah, thank you guys for being here. We appreciate you. Hit the like and subscribe button on your way out if you haven't done that already. And we'll see you guys on Thursday.
Yep, we're not here tomorrow anyway.
For MBR and Talk the Dog. We'll see you guys later.
Peace.